She was standing at the blackboard when her world ended. Not with a gunshot, not with a storm, with a whisper. Martha Good leaned into the doorway of the mercantile and said 7 words that would hollow out everything Vivian Mercer had spent 15 years building. That schoolteacher is carrying a bastard child. By noon, the whisper had become a roar. By sundown, the town of Dry Creek Crossing had already decided her sentence. No trial, no evidence, no mercy. If you've ever had someone destroy your name with nothing but their mouth, if you've ever stood in the middle of a crowd that used to love you and felt them turn cold, then you already know what Vivian felt that morning. And if you haven't, stay with me. Because what happens next will make you ask yourself one question you won't easily forget. What would you have done? Before we go further, if stories like this move you, if you believe that courage matters and that the truth is worth fighting for, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it reaches your heart, leave a like. It means more than you know. Now let's go back to Dry Creek Crossing. Let's go back to the morning everything broke. The schoolhouse at Dry Creek Crossing sat at the far end of Main Street like a period at the end of a sentence, plain, sturdy, unadorned. It had 3 windows on each side, a pot-bellied stove that smoked when the wind shifted from the north, and 22 wooden desks that Vivian Mercer had sanded smooth herself the summer she arrived, because she couldn't stand the thought of small hands picking up splinters while they were trying to learn something. That was Vivian. She didn't just teach, she prepared. She had been at the blackboard since 7:30, copying out the week's arithmetic problems in her clean, even hand when she heard the bell on the mercantile door jangle across the street. She didn't look up. She rarely did before the children arrived. That hour before school was hers, and she protected it the way some women protected their good china. The chalk scraped. The stove ticked. Outside, a horse clopped past on the packed dirt road. She was halfway through a long division problem when she heard it. Not the words themselves, not yet, but the particular quality of silence that follows something said in public that shouldn't have been said at all. That held breath pause that precedes a fire. She still didn't look up. She should have. Martha Good was 53 years old, twice widowed, and had the kind of face that looked like it had been shaped by decades of being the last one to hear the news and the first one to repeat it. She wore her grief like armor and her opinions like weapons, and on that Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of October, she positioned herself in the open doorway of Harlan Price's Mercantile, the geographic center of Dry Creek Crossing's gossip network, and she said what she said, 7 words. That schoolteacher is carrying a bastard child. She said it at a volume that was not quite a shout, but was not quite a murmur either. That middle register that lets a woman claim she was just talking to her neighbor while ensuring that every single person within 30 feet heard every syllable. Callie Price, behind the counter, dropped a tin of baking powder. Old Jim Dewey, sitting on the pickle barrel with his morning coffee, went very still. 2 young mothers selecting ribbon for their daughter's hair turned to look at each other with expressions that were equal parts horror and hunger. Martha Good smoothed the front of her black dress, looked neither left nor right, and stepped back out into the October sun. Her work was done. She had laid the match. Now she would watch the town burn what she wanted burned. Vivian didn't hear the words. She heard the aftermath. She heard the change in the way the street sounded, the way conversations stopped and started differently, the way footsteps paused, the way 2 women she recognized, Clara Hensley and Dot Ridgway, crossed to the other side of the road when they normally would have come by to wave through the window. She set down her chalk. She walked to the window. What she saw was ordinary, on the surface. People going about their morning, the blacksmith's hammer ringing, a dog sleeping in a patch of sunlight. But there was something wrong with the angles of it, the way heads were turned slightly, the way eyes moved without making contact, the way the town was performing normalcy while actually doing something else entirely. Vivian had been a teacher long enough to recognize that performance. She saw it in children who were hiding something they'd broken. She pressed her fingertips against the window frame. The first real warning she got was when the Henderson boy, 8 years old, gap-toothed, devoted to her, never missed a day of school, came running down the street and then slowed when he got close to the schoolhouse. She watched him stop 20 feet away. She watched him look back at something she couldn't see. She watched him turn around and go back the way he came. Tommy Henderson had never not come to school. Her stomach went cold. They started arriving at 9 o'clock. Not children, parents. Hector Villanueva came first, with his hat in his hands and his jaw set, which meant he'd been sent by his wife. He stood at the bottom of the schoolhouse steps and called up to her without coming any closer, like she was a creature he wasn't sure about. "Miss Mercer, my Ruth won't be coming to school today." Vivian stood in the doorway. "Is she ill, Mr. Villanueva?" He worked the brim of his hat through his fingers. "She ain't ill." "Then I'm afraid I don't understand." He looked up at her, then away. "I think you do, ma'am." He turned and walked back up the street without another word. She watched him go. Her hands were perfectly still at her sides because she had trained herself over 15 years to keep her hands still when she was frightened. It was a habit she had learned from her mother, who had been a minister's wife, which was essentially the same job as being a schoolteacher, except with a longer dress and lower pay. "Don't let them see you tremble," her mother had said. "Trembling just tells them they're right." She was trembling on the inside, but her hands were still. By 9:30, 4 more parents had come by with various versions of the same message. By 10, she understood what she was dealing with. The last one to come was Margaret Price, Harlan's wife, who had the decency, or perhaps the cruelty, to actually climb the steps and speak to her directly. Margaret Price was not a bad woman in the way that a drought isn't a bad thing. It's just the absence of something necessary, and everything dies around it anyway. She had a long, narrow face and the permanent expression of someone whose expectations had never quite been met. "I think you know why I'm here," Margaret said. "I know what's being said." Vivian kept her voice even. "And I know it isn't true." "Be that as it may." "It isn't be that as it may, Mrs. Price. It's either true or it isn't, and it isn't." Margaret Price blinked. She wasn't used to being interrupted. "Vivian, you have to understand, people are talking, parents have concerns. Until this is resolved, until a lie is resolved. It might be best if you stepped back from your duties." Vivian looked at the woman for a long moment. The chalk dust was still on her fingers. Behind Margaret, the schoolhouse was empty, quiet, smelling of sawdust and cold ash from the morning fire. "Stepped back," Vivian said slowly, "just temporarily. From the school I have run for 15 years. People are uncomfortable, Vivian. People are comfortable enough." Her voice had gone flat, which was worse than anger, she had found. People knew what to do with anger. Flat they didn't know how to handle. "Martha Good is comfortable enough. I'm the one who's been lied about." Margaret Price took one small step backward, as if the flatness had pushed her. "I understand you're upset." "I'm not upset, Mrs. Price." Vivian paused. "I'm trying to decide if this town is worth fighting for." She turned and went back inside and shut the door behind her. She stood with her back against the door in the empty schoolhouse, 22 empty desks in front of her, the chalk problem still unfinished on the board. Her breathing was careful and deliberate, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she breathed when a child was hurt and she needed to be calm for them. There were no children now. There was just her and the silence and the arithmetic problem she hadn't finished. She was 34 years old. She had come to Dry Creek Crossing at 19 with a trunk, a teaching certificate, and 72 cents to her name. She had built something here, not just a career, a life. She knew the name of every child in a 40-mile radius. She knew which ones learned by hearing and which by seeing, which ones needed firmness and which ones needed patience. She had held crying children after accidents and visited sick ones with soup and sat with grieving ones after the winter took their fathers or siblings or baby brothers. And now Martha Good had said 7 words. And it was all ash. She didn't cry. Not yet. What she did was sit down at her desk, pull out her gradebook, and look at the names. All of them. Every child she had taught, going back to that first year, when the roster was 11 students and she'd had to teach 3 grade levels simultaneously in a room with no heat until January. She looked at those names for a long time. Then she picked up her pen and wrote a letter. To the county school board. Formal, precise, grammatically correct. She described the situation. She requested an investigation into the source of the rumor. She used phrases like malicious defamation and grievous harm to professional standing because she had learned from watching the men who ran things that the right words in the right order could carry more weight than 100 tears. She sealed the letter. She put on her coat. She would deliver it herself. The moment she stepped out of the schoolhouse, she knew she had miscalculated. She had expected the town to have settled back into its routines by mid-morning. She had expected the initial flurry of gossip to have done its work and moved on, the way a creek floods and then drops. Instead, she walked out into what felt like a gathering. It wasn't an organized thing. There was no ringleader, no clear center, but there were perhaps 30 people distributed across the street and the boardwalk opposite the schoolhouse. And when she appeared in the doorway, most of them turned to look at her with that particular expression she had never before seen directed at herself, only at others. That expression that is worse than anger because at least anger contains acknowledgement of your existence. This was the look of a community deciding that you are a problem. She kept her chin level. She walked down the steps. She was 12 feet from the bottom when Elias Coburn stepped forward. Elias ran the feed store and served as one of 3 town councilmen, and he had never given her any particular trouble before. He was a large man, red-faced from years of outdoor work, and he wasn't cruel exactly. But he had the specific weakness of men who are not cruel on their own, but who will fold to a crowd every single time. "Miss Mercer," he said. He said it the way you say a word you're not sure about the spelling of. "Mr. Coburn, I think it'd be wise for you to stay inside today, given the circumstances." She stopped walking. "Given what circumstances, specifically?" He glanced back at the people on the boardwalk. She watched him do it. She watched him gather their presents like a coat. "The rumors," he said. "The lies," she said. "The word you're looking for is lies, Mr. Coburn." He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "Be that as it..." "Don't finish that sentence." She took a breath. "I have a letter to deliver to the county school board. I'm going to deliver it. Please step aside." He didn't step aside. He stood there with his big feed store hands hanging at his sides and the weight of the crowd behind him, and he looked at her with something she hadn't expected to see on Elias Coburn's face. Pity. Not anger. Not judgment. Pity. And somehow that was worse than everything else put together, because pity meant they had already decided how this ended. "Vivian." He lowered his voice, though it didn't matter. They could all hear. "Nobody's saying you're a bad person, but this town has got families to think about, and children, and people are going to keep their young ones away until this settles. You have to see that." "What I see," she said, "is a town that has made up its mind without asking me a single question. Now that's not... Has anyone asked me?" She raised her voice, not much, but enough. Enough for the 30 people on the street to hear her clearly. "Has one single person in Dry Creek Crossing knocked on my door and asked me whether what Martha Good said is true?" Silence. The street held its breath. She looked from face to face. Clara Hensley, Dot Ridgway, Hector Villanueva, the Harmon brothers from the livery, 2 women she knew by sight from the church she no longer attended, a man whose daughter she had taught to read 4 winters ago. Not one of them spoke. Not one of them had asked. She had given 15 years to this town, and not one person had thought to simply ask her if the thing they were burning her for was true. Her voice, when she spoke again, came from somewhere lower in her chest than usual. "I see." She looked at Elias Coburn one more time. "I will deliver my letter, and then I will go home, and I will wait for this town to decide whether it has any decency left in it." She walked forward. He moved. Not gracefully, but he moved. She walked through the center of the street with 30 pairs of eyes on her back and her hands perfectly still at her sides. And she walked past the feed store and the livery and the barber and the bakery where she had bought bread every Friday for 15 years, and she did not look at anyone, and no one spoke to her. And by the time she reached the post office, she was so cold with suppressed fury that she was almost shaking. She pushed open the post office door. Inside, behind the counter, Hiram Walsh looked up at her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. "I need this delivered to the county school board," she said. Her voice was perfectly controlled. "Today." He took the letter. He looked at her name on it. "I heard what they're saying," he said quietly. "Yes." She didn't elaborate. He put the letter in the outgoing post without another word. He was a small man, unremarkable in almost every way, and she had barely thought about him in 15 years. But at that moment, his silence, the particular silence of a man who took her letter without comment and without judgment, was the first kindness anyone had shown her since morning. She nodded at him. He nodded back. She went back out into the street. The crowd had grown. She saw that immediately. And something had shifted in it. A temperature change. A different kind of energy. Less uncertain and more decided. Someone had said something while she was inside. Someone had added fuel. She would learn later that it was Martha Good herself, who had moved through the crowd in those 3 minutes, saying, "She won't even deny it. She just came out and walked right past us like we're nothing, like she doesn't owe us an explanation." Which was not precisely what had happened. But precision is not what a crowd needs. She was 10 steps from the post office when she heard someone behind her say, loud enough to be heard but not loud enough to be directly addressed, "She ought to pack her things and go somewhere that wants her kind." She stopped walking. She turned around. She couldn't tell who had said it. Several of the men near the back of the gathering were looking elsewhere, the cowards tell. She held her gaze steady on the group. "Whoever said that," she said clearly, "doesn't have the courage to say it to my face, which tells me everything I need to know about the character of the person who said it." A murmur moved through the crowd. It wasn't agreement or disagreement. It was the specific murmur of a group surprised by someone who refuses to be ashamed. And then the murmur stopped, because from behind her, from up the street, came the sound of a horse at a deliberate pace, and then a second, and then the particular stillness that follows when someone significant arrives somewhere. She didn't turn around yet. She watched the crowd's faces change before she turned. She watched the hostility soften into something else. Not respect exactly, but the specific deference of people who need money or land or water or work. That deference that Western towns showed to power, regardless of whether they liked the man who held it. Then she turned around, and she saw Gideon Ashcroft for the first time since she had moved to Dry Creek Crossing. He was on a gray horse, unhurried, with 2 of his ranch hands a few lengths behind him. He was not a dramatically large man, not the kind of man you'd notice in a city. But out here, where the land was big and most men were visibly diminished by it, he moved through the world as if the space around him was exactly the right size. He had dark hair going silver at the temples, and the kind of face that had been weathered not by hardship, but by time spent outdoors by choice rather than necessity. A distinction that showed in the way he held himself. He wore no gun that she could see, which in a territory where most men wore their weapons like jewelry was itself a kind of statement. He stopped his horse. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Vivian. And then, slowly, with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has never once in his adult life said anything he didn't intend to say, Gideon Ashcroft looked out at the 30 people gathered in the street in front of her and he said, "I heard there's some talk going around about Miss Mercer." Nobody answered. The crowd had gone very still. He looked at Vivian once more, and there was something in his eyes she couldn't immediately identify. Not recognition, because they didn't know each other, but something closer to assessment, and beneath that, something that looked almost like decision. "If there's a child," he said, in a voice that carried easily in the cold October air, "it's mine." The silence that followed was absolute. Vivian stared at him. He met her eyes without apology, without explanation, without any expression she could quite interpret, and he said, in a slightly quieter voice that was still somehow perfectly audible to everyone present, "Are you all right, Vivian?" And she had absolutely no idea. Not a single thought. Not a single breath of an idea. What to say. Vivian didn't answer him right away. She couldn't. The words had hit her the way cold water hits a burned hand, the shock of it arriving before the meaning did, before her mind could organize any kind of response to what had just been said in the middle of the street in front of 30 people who were now looking at her with entirely new expressions. Not pity anymore. Not judgment. Something more complicated than both. She looked at Gideon Ashcroft on his gray horse, and she thought, with perfect clarity, that she had never spoken more than a dozen words to this man in her life. She had seen him at a distance. Everyone in Dry Creek Crossing had seen him at a distance, because distance was the primary relationship most people had with Gideon Ashcroft. He came to town when he needed to. He conducted his business. He left. He did not attend socials. He did not make small talk at the mercantile. He was not unfriendly exactly, but he had the quality of a man who had decided, at some point, how much of himself he was going to give to the world, and had simply never revised that decision. And now he had just stood in the middle of Main Street and claimed a child that didn't exist as his own. "I'm fine," she said. The words came out steadier than she had any right to expect. Something in his face shifted, almost imperceptibly. Not quite relief, something more guarded than that. He nodded once, as if she had answered a different and more important question. Then he looked out at the crowd again. At Elias Coburn, specifically, who was standing with his mouth slightly open, which was not his best look. At Margaret Price, who had appeared from somewhere and whose face had cycled through 4 distinct expressions in the last 20 seconds. At the 2 women from church. At all of them. "I'd appreciate it," Gideon said, in the tone of a man who is expressing a preference while making very clear it is also a warning. "If the people of this town would direct their questions to me rather than to Miss Mercer. She's had a hard enough morning." Nobody said anything. He swung down from his horse, slowly, without drama, like a man getting off a horse rather than performing the act of getting off a horse, and he walked toward her. His boots on the packed dirt made a deliberate sound. He stopped about 3 feet away from her, which was close enough to make a statement and far enough to not be presumptuous, and he said quietly enough that the crowd had to lean in slightly to catch it. "My wagon's up the street. If you're willing, I'd like to take you somewhere you can sit down." She looked at him for a long moment. His eyes were gray-green, she noticed, and very direct, and there was something in them that was not quite asking and not quite telling. Something that sat precisely between the two, as if he had learned long ago that the difference between a request and a command was often just a matter of tone. "I don't need to sit down," she said. "No," he agreed, "but you might want to." She almost said no. Everything in her that had been standing straight for the last 3 hours wanted to say no, because saying yes to this man felt like a different kind of surrender, and she had just spent 30 minutes refusing to surrender to the town. She was not in the habit of going from one person's protection to another's. She had not survived 15 years in a frontier town by leaning on anyone who offered, but she also looked at the crowd behind him, and she thought about what would happen if she walked back to the schoolhouse alone. And she thought about the empty desks and the chalk problem she hadn't finished, and she thought about the fact that her hands, which had been perfectly still all morning, were starting, very slightly, to shake. "All right," she said. "Look." The wagon was a working wagon, not a showpiece. Scratched wood, a bench seat that had seen better decades, a horse that was not beautiful but looked extremely capable. Gideon's 2 ranch hands stayed a respectful distance behind as he helped her up, not taking her arm exactly, just being present enough that she could choose to use him as support if she needed to, which she did not. But she noted the difference between that and the kind of man who grabs your elbow and steers you like cargo. They rode in silence for 2 full minutes before she said anything. "You don't know me," she said. "No," he said. "You've said something publicly that isn't true." "I've said something publicly that can't be disproved," he said, which was not the same thing, and they both knew it. She looked at the side of his face. "Why?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "My sister's name was Clara. She died 6 years ago. She was 22. He paused. "She didn't die from anything physical." Vivian waited. A woman in the town where she was living started a rumor. He kept his eyes on the road. His voice was flat and even, the way a voice gets when it has had years to process something and has arrived at a place that isn't peace. Exactly, but is past the raw part. Not unlike what's been done to you today. People believed it because people wanted to. Nobody stood up. Nobody asked whether it was true. And Clara... He stopped. He started again. Clara decided the shame was easier to carry if she wasn't there to carry it. The wagon moved through the edge of town. The sound of the street fell away behind them. "I'm sorry," Vivian said. She meant it in the plain way, not in the social reflex way. She meant it the way you mean it when someone tells you something true. "I swore something after that," he said. "I don't make promises about what I'll do in any situation, because situations are unpredictable. But I swore I would never watch what happened to Clara happen to another woman and do nothing. If I have the means to stop it, I stop it." He glanced at her sideways. "Today, I had the means." She thought about that. She thought about the words "did nothing" and what they must have meant to him for 6 years. "What happens now?" she asked. "That depends on you." "That's not an answer. It's the only honest one I've got." He looked at the road. If you want to go back to your rooms and wait for this to settle on its own, I'll take you there. I won't interfere further. What I've done today buys you some time. People aren't going to press a woman that I've publicly claimed, not in this territory, not if they want to keep doing business with my ranch. But it's temporary. Gossip has a short attention span except when it has a target, and you're still the target. And if I don't want to wait for it to settle on its own? He was quiet for a moment. When he answered, his voice was careful. Then there's another option, but I want to be clear about something before I tell you what it is. Go ahead. I'm not offering you charity. He said the word like he'd heard it described as a flavor he found unpleasant. I'm not asking you to be grateful. I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you already are, which, from what I can see, is a woman who's considerably more capable than this town has been treating her. He paused. What I'm offering is a plan, a practical one. And if you think it's a bad plan, you tell me so. I'll tell you either way, she said. Something that was almost a smile crossed his face, so briefly she wasn't entirely sure she'd seen it. I figured you would. What? The Ashcroft Ranch was 12 miles from Dry Creek Crossing, which meant Vivian had ridden past its outer fence line probably 100 times without ever being on the other side of it. Up close, it was larger than it looked from the road. Not opulent, nothing about it was opulent, but it was solid in the way that things built well and maintained carefully are solid, the kind of solid that outlasts fashions and weather and bad years alike. There was a main house, a bunkhouse, 3 large outbuildings, and a kitchen garden that looked like it had been planted by someone who took vegetables seriously. 2 dogs came out to inspect the wagon's arrival, decided everything was acceptable, and wandered back to wherever they'd been. A woman of about 50, built like someone who could move furniture without asking for help, appeared in the doorway of the main house and looked at the wagon with the expression of someone who was neither surprised nor particularly impressed. That's Nora, Gideon said. She's run this house for 11 years. She doesn't gossip, she doesn't pry, and she makes very good coffee. Is she going to ask questions about why you've brought a woman here? Probably not to my face, he said. He helped her down from the wagon. The 2 dogs came back to smell her boots. She stood in the yard and looked at the main house and thought about how strange it was that the geography of a single morning could deposit you somewhere so entirely different from where you'd started. Nora did not ask questions. She brought coffee, dark and unequivocal, and a plate of something that had cornmeal in it, and she set them on the table in what appeared to be a room used for actual work. Maps on the walls, papers on the table, 2 lamps, a fireplace that was laid but unlit. Then she looked at Vivian with the assessment of a woman who has worked alongside a taciturn man long enough to read the space around him for information. Rough morning, Nora said. It was not a question. Rough morning, Vivian agreed. Nora nodded, like something had been confirmed, and went back to her kitchen. Gideon laid it out plainly, which she appreciated. She had a low tolerance for preamble, and he seemed to have none at all. Martha Good is not going to stop, he said. Not on her own. She did what she did deliberately, and she did it knowing you didn't have anyone with enough standing in this town to counter her. People with means and influence tend to get left alone. People without it tend to get talked about. I'm aware of how Vivian said. I know you are. I'm saying it out loud because the plan requires you to understand that public perception in this territory is tied to association. Who you stand next to matters. He set his coffee down. What I said this morning in the street, that we're connected, that you're under that I have a stake in your situation, that changed the calculation for the people who are preparing to drive you out. But it only holds if we sustain it. She looked at him steadily. Sustain it how? A public engagement, he said. He said it the way you'd say irrigation plan or winter livestock count, as a practical matter without romance or apology. Not a real one. Or not, it doesn't have to be real. The terms are yours to set. But if we appear in town together, if there are credible grounds for people to believe that whatever rumor Martha Good started is simply misidentified fact rather than slander, then the ground shifts entirely. It shifts to me being a kept woman, Vivian said. He shook his head. It shifts to you being a woman someone in this territory is willing to publicly align himself with. That's different. Is it? It is if you make it so. He met her eyes. Which is where your character matters more than mine. People in this territory respect strength. They've watched you run that school for 15 years. If you walk back into town standing straight, not hiding, not apologizing, beside someone who makes clear you have his full regard and his backing, the story changes. Martha Good's version stops being the only one. Vivian wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. The warmth was steadying in a way she hadn't expected to need. And the legal piece, she said, you mentioned in the wagon. There's a lawyer in Caldwell, he said, Henry Marsh. He's handled defamation cases before, frontier law specifically. What Martha Good did has a name under territorial statutes. It's actionable. It won't be quick, and it won't be comfortable. And she'll have people who'll defend her because they always do. He paused. But it can be won. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Outside, one of the dogs barked twice at something and then went silent. The fire in the grate was unlit and the room was cool. Not uncomfortably so, but the kind of cool that makes you aware of your own skin. You've thought about this, she said. I had 12 miles of road to think about it on the way into town this morning. She looked at him. You came into town intending to find a situation to intervene in. I came into town for feed and lumber. He was perfectly matter of fact. I heard what was being said at the first stop I made. After that, yes. She considered him. She considered the plan. She thought about 15 years and 22 desks, sanded smooth, and children she had taught to read. And she thought about Clara Ashcroft, 22 years old, deciding the shame was easier without her. She thought about her mother. Don't let them see you tremble. If I do this, she said carefully, I need you to understand something. Go ahead. I'm not doing it because I need a man to rescue me. She kept her voice level, not aggressive, not defensive, simply direct, the way she spoke when she was telling a child something important for the last time before the lesson moved on. I am not doing it because I've run out of options, or because I'm afraid, or because I've decided you're some kind of answer to a problem I can't solve myself. I can leave this territory. I have skills and a letter of reference, and I'm 34 years old, not 84. I can rebuild somewhere else if I choose to. He didn't say anything. He was listening, she realized. Actually listening, not just waiting for her to finish. I would be doing this, she continued, because I think Martha Good should not be allowed to destroy what took 15 years to build and walk away without consequence. I would be doing it because those 22 children deserve a school, and because I am not ready to be driven out of a life I made myself. She paused. And because if your plan is a good one, then leaving would just be easier, and I have never trusted easy. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then he said, Those are good reasons. What are yours? She asked. Your real ones. Not the ones about your sister because that's part of it, but it isn't all of it. Nobody rides 12 miles into town on a Tuesday morning and upends their public reputation for a stranger purely out of principle. The silence that followed was longer than the ones before it. She had the sense of having pressed somewhere real, and she watched his face to see whether he'd close off or continue, the way you watch a door when you're not sure whether it's going to open or shut. He picked up his coffee. He set it back down without drinking. This town, he said, has been where I've built everything I've built. My father started this ranch, and I've made it what it is, and I've made it here, in this territory. These roads, this water, these families. And I have watched, for years, the way Martha Good and people like her operate. They use shame the way a hammer uses a nail. They find the person who has the least social protection, and they drive it in. He looked at the wall, then back at her. I've been able to ignore it before because the targets have usually had someone. Family, a husband, someone. You don't. He stopped. That's not a judgment, that's a fact. And I have watched what facts like that do in towns like this one, and he stopped again. I am tired of watching it, he finished, which was not quite what he'd started to say, she thought, but was probably the truest version of it. She nodded. All right, she said. All right, you'll consider it? All right, I'll do it. She set down her cup. But I want to be part of the legal strategy, not just standing next to you while the lawyer talks. I want to know what's being filed and why and what the arguments are. I was educated. I am not a decoration. I wouldn't expect you to be. And I want it understood between us, regardless of what we present to this town, that this is a working arrangement, a practical one. Not, she stopped, because she wasn't sure quite how to finish the sentence without saying something that sounded either naive or presumptuous. Not more than that, he said, completing it. His tone was completely neutral, which somehow made it easier. Not more than that, she agreed, unless things change. But that's not a conversation for today. He looked at her for a moment. No, he said, it's not. She stayed at the ranch that night because going back to town before they decided how to present themselves would have been tactically foolish, and Vivian Mercer, whatever else she was not tactically foolish. Nora gave her a room that was plain and clean and had a window that looked east, which meant she could watch the sun set on one side of the sky and think about what morning was going to look like. She didn't sleep well. That wasn't surprising. What surprised her was the sound she heard around midnight, the particular creak of someone moving carefully through a house they know well, not wanting to wake anyone else. She heard it pass her door, heard it continue to what she later learned was the back porch, and she lay in the dark and thought about a man sitting outside in the middle of the night in October, and about a sister named Clara, and about what it cost to carry a promise like the one he'd made for 6 years. She didn't go out. It wasn't her place. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But she lay there listening to the quiet, and somewhere in it she stopped shaking. The trembling that had been in her chest all day, the deep internal one that had nothing to do with her hands. And she thought about the fact that she had not been alone in the street today. Someone had ridden 12 miles on a Tuesday and gotten off his horse and said the bravest and strangest and most complicated thing she had ever heard anyone say in her life. She didn't know what to do with that yet, but she filed it carefully, the way she filed things she intended to come back to. Morning arrived cold and clear, the sky that particular shade of blue that only happens after a frost. Vivian was up before Nora, which earned her a look of mild surprise and what appeared to be a small increase in Nora's already limited vocabulary. "Coffee's ready," Nora said. "Gideon's in the yard." She took her coffee and went to the back door. He was standing at the fence that separated the yard from the first pasture, looking at something in the middle distance with the concentrated stillness of a man solving a problem in his head. He hadn't heard her yet, or he'd heard her and was choosing not to react. She couldn't tell which, and she filed that away too, the uncertainty, because she had found that in her experience, the things you can't quite read in a person are usually the most important things about them. "We should go today," she said. He turned. He had a cup in his hand too. He looked at her with the morning light on his face, and she thought, not for the first time, that he was not precisely what he appeared at first glance, which was a man who managed large quantities of land and livestock. He was that. But there was something else underneath it, something that read and noticed and filed things away, and she recognized the habit because she had it herself. "Today?" he said. "If we wait, we give them more time to solidify the story without us in it. Every day we're not visible is a day Martha Good's version is the only version." She looked at the pasture. "I want to go to the mercantile. I want to buy bread, the same bread I buy every Friday, and I want to do it with you beside me, not hiding behind you, and I want the town to see that I'm not ashamed of something I didn't do." He was quiet for a moment. "That's going to be uncomfortable. I'm aware. People are going to say things. They're going to say things whether I'm in town or not. At least if I'm there, I can hear them." She turned to look at him directly. "Can you be ready in an hour?" He looked at her for a moment with that expression she still couldn't quite categorize, assessment, and something behind it, something that might have been respect or might have been something else. She couldn't yet tell. "I can be ready in 30 minutes, he said. Nora packed them a basket without being asked, which was her way of endorsing the plan without saying so. She included cornbread from the night before, 2 apples, and a jar of something preserved that rattled, and she handed it to Vivian specifically, not to Gideon, which felt like a statement. "You come back for supper if you need to," Nora said. It was the longest sentence she had produced in Vivian's presence. She said it while looking at a spot on the counter, not at either of them, which was somehow exactly right. "Thank you, Nora," Vivian said. Nora went back to the kitchen. The ride to town was different from the evening before. The silence was different, less charged, less careful. They actually talked, about things that had nothing to do with plans or strategies, because 12 miles is 12 miles and some of it has to be filled. He asked her, without ceremony, how she had ended up in Dry Creek Crossing specifically, and she told him about the certificate and the 72 cents and the teaching board that had exactly 1 posting available in a Frontier Territory school, and how she had applied for it because, at 19, Frontier had sounded like freedom. "Was it?" he asked. She considered it honestly. "Mostly yes. Sometimes no." She looked at the road. Freedom has a price that nobody mentions before you buy it. He made a sound that might have been agreement. What's the price? Loneliness, mostly, but the specific kind that comes from choosing it yourself, which makes it harder to complain about. He was quiet for a moment, then, I know that kind. She looked at him. He didn't elaborate, but the two words sat between them for the rest of the ride. Not awkward, not demanding anything, just present, like a third person who didn't need to talk. They arrived in Dry Creek Crossing just before 10 in the morning, which was when the street was at its fullest. Vivian had timed it deliberately. She wanted an audience for exactly the reason she'd stated the night before. Not because she wanted attention, but because attention, correctly managed, was the most powerful counter to gossip that existed, and she intended to manage it correctly. She felt the shift when they turned onto Main Street. She felt the heads turn. She felt the recalibration happening in real time, as people who had watched her walk alone through their contempt. Yesterday saw her returning today beside the largest landowner in 40 miles, sitting straight on the wagon bench with her hands in her lap and her chin at exactly the angle she'd been keeping it for 24 hours now. Gideon pulled up in front of the mercantile. He got down first, came around, offered his hand. She took it, not because she needed the help, but because the gesture was visible, and visible was the point. They walked into Harlan Price's mercantile together. Harlan Price was behind his counter, and he looked up, and for one suspended moment his face tried to do several things simultaneously. He had known Vivian for 15 years. He had known Gideon Ashcroft for longer. He had probably, in the last 24 hours, told his wife a version of the previous day's events that he was now rapidly revising. "Morning, Harlan," Gideon said. "Morning, Gideon." Harlan's voice was slightly higher than normal. "Miss Mercer." "Mr. Price," Vivian said pleasantly. "I'd like the usual Friday order, the brown bread if you have it, and half a pound of the good coffee." He got it. He didn't make conversation, but he got it without incident, and he charged her the correct price. And when she counted out the coins, he took them without looking anywhere but her hand, which was its own kind of apology. There were 4 other people in the store. She was aware of all of them the way you're aware of weather, not focused on any one of them, but tracking the atmospheric pressure. 2 she recognized as mothers of children she'd taught. 1 was a man from the hardware side of the establishment, pretending to examine a roll of wire. The 4th was a young woman she barely knew who stood near the door and looked at Vivian with an expression she hadn't expected to see. Not hostility, something that looked unexpectedly like hope. Vivian met the young woman's eyes. She didn't smile, it wasn't the moment for a smile. But she held the eye contact for a beat longer than necessary, and the young woman's chin came up slightly, almost involuntarily, as if something in the gesture had lifted it. That moment lasted about 2 seconds. Then they were back on the street in the cold October sun, with the bread and the coffee, and Gideon was untying the horse, and Vivian stood next to the wagon and breathed the cold air and thought, one store, one morning, one small thing held. It wasn't victory. It wasn't close to victory. Martha Good was still somewhere in this town with her 2 widowed face and her 7 words and her satisfaction at watching what she'd built. The school was still closed. The letter to the county board was probably sitting in a post office somewhere between here and Caldwell. The lawyer was 12 miles in the other direction. There was a long road ahead. She knew that with complete clarity. But she had walked back into this town and bought her bread and looked a frightened young woman in the eyes and held her own, and nobody had said a word to her face, and the ground under her feet was still her ground, still this territory, still this life she had made. She climbed into the wagon. Gideon got in beside her. He said nothing, which was correct. They had been on the road for 5 minutes when a rider came fast from behind them, pulling up alongside the wagon at a pace that meant news. Vivian recognized him as one of Gideon's ranch hands, the younger one, Pete, who had a face like someone had assembled it slightly too fast, but who rode like he'd been born on a horse. "Mr. Ashcroft." Pete was slightly out of breath. "Someone left a message at the ranch. A letter. Ryder brought it from Caldwell this morning, early." He held it out. "It's got a law seal on it." Gideon took it. He held the reins in one hand and turned the letter over with the other. He looked at the seal. He passed it to Vivian without explanation, because the seal said Territorial Law Office, Caldwell, and it was addressed, not to him, but to her. She broke it open. She read it once, quickly, to get the sense of it. Then she read it again slowly, because the words required that. Her letter to the county school board had arrived in Caldwell 24 hours before she'd sent it, which meant someone else had already written. She looked at the signature at the bottom of the letter. She read it 3 times because she didn't believe it the first 2. The letter was from Henry Marsh, attorney. It was brief and formal and professional, and it said, in the specific language of territorial law, that he had been retained on her behalf and was prepared to begin proceedings against the party responsible for defamatory statements made in a public forum in Dry Creek Crossing on the 3rd week of October, and that he required her attendance at his office at her earliest possible convenience. He had been retained on her behalf. She looked up at Gideon. He was watching the road. "You did this yesterday," she said, "before we'd spoken, before I'd agreed to anything." "I sent Pete ahead before I rode into town," he said. "Not apologetically, not defensively, just factually." She sat with that for a moment. "You were that certain I'd want to fight." He glanced at her sideways. "I was that certain you deserved the option," he said. "Whether you took it was up to you." She looked down at the letter in her hands. The cold air moved her hair. The horse's breath made small clouds. Somewhere in the fields to the left, a crow called once and went quiet. She thought about a woman standing at a blackboard at 7:30 in the morning with chalk dust on her hands, with 22 clean desks behind her and 15 years in front of her. She thought about the moment the street had gone wrong. She thought about Tommy Henderson stopping 20 feet from the schoolhouse and turning back. She folded the letter carefully. She put it in her coat pocket. "I'll need to send word to my rooms," she said. "I'll need some of my things if I'm going to Caldwell." "I know a good road," Gideon said. "I'd expect nothing less," she said. He didn't say anything else. She didn't either. The wagon moved through the October morning, and behind them Dry Creek Crossing sat in the cold sunlight exactly as it always had, except that everything in it had shifted, and nothing, not Martha Good, not Elias Coburn, not 30 people with their silences and their sideways looks, was going to put it back the way it had been. She had decided that in the schoolhouse, with the chalk still in her hand. She was just now beginning to believe it. The road to Caldwell took the better part of a day, which was long enough for Vivian to organize her thinking, and short enough that she didn't have time to talk herself out of anything. She had learned, over 15 years of teaching children who were afraid of things, that there was a precise window between deciding to do something difficult and actually doing it, and that window had to be used correctly. Too much time to think, and the fear moved in and rearranged the furniture. Not enough time, and you arrived unprepared. The road to Caldwell was, by accident or design, almost exactly the right length. She had stopped at her rooms on the way out of Dry Creek Crossing. The building where she rented a 2-room apartment above the dry goods storage was owned by a man named Bert Caldwell, no relation to the town, who had the decency to be away when she arrived, and the indecency to have left a note on her door that said, in his cramped and uncertain handwriting, that he hoped things would be sorted out soon, and that he'd need a decision about the rooms by end of month. She had read it twice, folded it precisely in half, and set it on the kitchen table where he would find it when he came to collect rent. She packed what she needed in a single bag. She did not pack as if she were leaving for good. She packed as if she were going somewhere specific and coming back. Gideon waited with the wagon. He did not ask how long she'd been or what had been left on her door. He just handed her up when she came out with her bag, and they kept moving. She told him about the note on the road, because withholding it felt like a kind of pretense she didn't have the energy for. He listened. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You can stay at the ranch as long as you need to." He said it with the same tone he used for all practical statements. No softness applied to cushion it, no hardness either, just the plain surface of a fact being offered. "That's going to generate its own set of talk," she said. "It will," he agreed. "You're not concerned." "I'm concerned about a lot of things," he said. "Other people's talk is fairly low on the list." She looked at him. "It wasn't low on the list when it was your sister." He didn't flinch, which she respected. "No," he said. "It wasn't, but that was different. Clara didn't have anyone positioned to absorb the blow with her. You do." "You." "Me." He said it simply, without self-congratulation. "For whatever that's worth." She thought about what it was worth and found the answer more complicated than she expected, which was a problem she set aside for later. Henry Marsh's office in Caldwell was on the second floor of a building that had started life as a bank and then failed to be one, which left it with a certain architectural dignity and a ground floor that now housed a harness repair shop. The stairs were steep and the landing at the top was smaller than it looked from below, and the door to Marsh's office had a frosted glass panel that said his name backward from the inside when the light caught it right. He was a compact man, somewhere between 50 and 60, with the manner of someone who had spent decades listening carefully to things people would rather not have said out loud, and had developed, as a result, an extremely good poker face and very direct eyes. He stood when Vivian came in. He shook her hand before he shook Gideon's, which she noted without making anything of it. "Miss Mercer," he said, "sit down. I have some things to tell you that you may not like." "I haven't liked most things that have been told to me this week," she said. "Go ahead." He sat. He had a file already open on his desk, which meant he had done work before their arrival, which meant the letter Pete had delivered was not the beginning of his preparation. She looked at Gideon. He was looking at the wall. She looked back at the lawyer. "Martha Good," Marsh said without preamble, "is not simply a bitter woman with a loose tongue." He set a paper on the desk in front of her. "She has done this before." Vivian looked at the paper. It was a legal document, territorial court, 7 years prior. She scanned it. "A dismissed complaint," she said. "Dismissed for lack of sufficient testimony, not for lack of evidence." He set a second paper beside the first. 4 years ago. Different territory, different woman. A dressmaker. The case didn't make it to court." He paused. "The dressmaker left town." Vivian looked at the papers. 2 women. 2 different places. The same mechanism, apparently. She thought about Martha Good at the door of the mercantile, at that middle volume that was not quite a shout and not quite a murmur. And she thought about how a person learns to calibrate something like that, how a person gets better at it, with practice. "She targeted me specifically," Vivian said. It wasn't a question. "Almost certainly." Marsh folded his hands on the desk. "You are single, established, and without immediate family in the territory. You have a position of influence over children, and—" he hesitated briefly. "I believe there is a specific grievance, personal in nature." "What grievance?" He looked at her. "The county school board considered, 3 months ago, the question of expanding the Dry Creek Crossing School District. The proposal included a second teaching position and additional funding." He paused. "Martha Good's late husband's nephew applied for that position. He was not selected." The room was quiet for a moment. "She blamed me," Vivian said. "The board selected you to lead the expanded program," Marsh said carefully. "Whether she blamed you directly or simply identified you as the obstacle, the effect is the same." Vivian sat with that for a moment. She had not known about any of it. Not the nephew, not the grievance, none of it. She had received a letter from the board saying the expansion was under review and that she should expect further word, and she had filed it and gone back to teaching. She had not known she had been accumulating an enemy, that particular brand of ignorance, the kind where you don't know you're losing ground until the ground is gone, was somehow the worst kind. At least if you knew someone was coming for you, you could turn around. "All right," she said. She straightened in her chair. "What do we have to work with?" What they had to work with was less than Vivian would have liked and more than nothing, which was roughly the position she'd been in most of her adult life. Marsh laid it out methodically. The territorial defamation statute required proof of 3 things: that the statement was false, that it was made publicly and intentionally, and that it caused measurable harm. The first 2 were straightforward. The third was where cases like this typically stumbled, because harm was slippery and courts were inconsistent and frontier judges varied wildly in how much patience they had for anything that wasn't a property dispute or a shooting. "The harm to your professional standing," Marsh said, "is documentable. Parents kept their children home. The town council moved to suspend your duties without formal process. Those are facts on paper. But—" he tapped his pen on the desk. "Martha Good's lawyer, and she will get one, she has money, will argue that the community reaction was not caused by her statement, but by legitimate public concern. He'll argue the statement was a private communication misunderstood as public. He'll argue—" "She said it in a doorway," Vivian said, "in front of at least 7 people that I can name." "I know. And those 7 people will need to testify." Vivian thought about the people she could name. Callie Price, old Jim Dewey, the 2 women with the ribbon. She didn't know the others well enough to predict them. She looked at Gideon. Will people testify? He was leaning against the wall behind her, and he answered without moving. Some will, some won't. The ones who won't are afraid of Martha Good's money and her connections. He said it plainly, because plain was how he said things. But some will. Who? He looked at the ceiling briefly. Jim Dewey's got nothing to lose and never liked her. Callie Price will do what Harlan tells her, and Harlan knows which side of this he wants to be on when it's over. He paused. There are others. I'll need to talk to them myself, Vivian said. Marsh looked at her over his desk. That's not typically how it... I'm aware of how it's typically done. She met his eyes. But you said yourself that the harm to my professional standing is documentable. The most direct way to document it is for those 7 people to hear from me directly. Not from a lawyer, not from a proxy. That I am fighting this and that I expect them to tell the truth. She folded her hands in her lap. People are more willing to be brave when they see someone else being brave first. Marsh looked at her for a moment. Then he made a note in his file. All right, he said. We do it your way on the witness preparation. But Miss Mercer, Vivian. He set down his pen. I have to be honest with you about something. You've been honest with me since I walked through the door. Don't stop now. He looked at her steadily. This case is winnable. I believe that genuinely. But Martha Good is going to make it personal before it's over. She's going to say things in public, before the trial, that are worse than what she said the first time. She's going to find other people to say things. She's going to try to make you so tired and so humiliated and so worn down that you drop the case before it gets to the judge. He paused. It has worked before. Both times. The women dropped it. Vivian looked at him. She looked at the papers on his desk. 2 women, 2 cases, both dropped. She thought about a dressmaker who had packed her things and left. The women who dropped it, she said. Were they wrong too? He considered the question with more seriousness than she'd expected. No, he said. They made the best decision available to them at the time, with the resources they had. He met her eyes. You have different resources. She thought about what that meant. She thought about Gideon against the wall behind her, and the lawyer in front of her, and the letter in her coat pocket, and the ranch 12 miles from a town that had tried to erase her. Then let's not waste them, she said. They stayed 2 nights in Caldwell, which was not Vivian's preference, but was logistically necessary. Marsh needed time to file the preliminary papers, and Vivian needed time to review everything he was filing, which she did at his desk while he was at dinner on the first evening, reading territorial statutes with the same concentrated attention she brought to a student's arithmetic work that didn't add up right. Gideon came back from whatever errand he'd been on to find her still at the desk, 4 pages deep into the defamation statute, with 2 empty coffee cups and a list of questions on a separate sheet of paper. You should eat something, he said. I ate. She didn't look up. There's a question in Section 4 about the standard of intent. It says the plaintiff must prove the statement was made with knowledge of its falsity or reckless disregard for the truth. Do we have evidence of either for Martha Good specifically, or are we relying on the jury to infer it from pattern? He was quiet for a moment. I don't know enough law to answer that. Marsh will know. I'm writing it down so I ask him in the morning. She looked up finally. He was still in his coat, which meant he'd just come in. What were you doing? Sending some wires. He said it carefully, in the way that meant there was more, but he was gauging how much to offer. She waited. To some people in the county who have standing, he said. Council members. A judge I've done business with. Not asking for anything improper. Just making sure the right people know that this case is being filed and that I have a personal interest in it being taken seriously. She looked at him. That's using your influence. Yes. I said I wasn't doing this to hide behind your wealth. You're not hiding behind it. It's working in the background where you can't see it, like drainage pipes. His tone was neutral. The water still flows whether you think about the pipes or not. She sat with that analogy for a moment. It bothered her, and it was also, she had to admit, not wrong. Tell me next time, she said, before you do it, not after. Fair enough. He sat down in the chair across the desk. He looked tired in a way she hadn't seen on him before. Not depleted, but like a man who had been running a particular kind of careful energy all day and was letting it down for the first time. How are you doing? And I mean, actually. The question surprised her. Not because it was unexpected from a kind person, but because in 3 days of considerable crisis, it was the first time anyone had asked her that specific question, using that specific word, actually, as if they understood that the standard answer and the true answer were likely to be different things. She considered giving him the standard answer. She set it aside. "I'm frightened," she said. "Not in the way I was frightened on Tuesday morning when everything was immediate and I couldn't think. That was sharp fear, like a cut. This is different. This is the slow kind. The kind that comes when you know exactly what you're walking into and you've decided to walk into it anyway." She paused. "I keep thinking about the children, Tommy Henderson specifically. He's 8. He turned around 20 feet from the schoolhouse because his parents told him to. He didn't know why, he just knew it had something to do with me, and I keep thinking about what that looks like from where he's standing." Gideon was quiet, listening in the way he did, not filling silences, just holding them. "I'm angry too," she said, underneath the frightened. "I've been teaching for 15 years, and I've never once given anyone in that town reason to doubt my character, and it took Martha Good 30 seconds to undo it." She looked at the papers on the desk. "That kind of anger is useful in a courtroom, I think. But it has to be clean anger, not messy. The messy kind makes you say things you can't take back." "You'll keep it clean," he said. Not as flattery, as a simple observation like he'd seen enough of her in 3 days to make it. "Probably," she said. "But it's work." He nodded. He got up. "There's food downstairs at the hotel dining room until 9 o'clock. I'll be down there if you want to eat." He left without pressing the issue, which was becoming a characteristic she noticed consistently in him. He did not push. He offered and retreated, and let her come to things at her own speed. It was an unusual quality in a man who ran 40,000 acres and was accustomed, presumably, to being obeyed. She finished her notes. She went downstairs. She ate. The drive back to Dry Creek Crossing 3 days after they'd left. It was a different experience than the 2 that preceded it. The road was the same, the cold was the same, but something in the quality of the silence between them had changed. Not warmed exactly, more like it had settled into itself, found its shape, the way new wood settles into a frame once it's been exposed to weather. They were 4 miles from town when Gideon said, "There's something I want to ask you." "Go ahead." "The school board expansion, the position they selected you to lead." He watched the road. "Do you still want it? Or has all of this changed what you want from this territory?" She thought about it honestly. "I want the school," she said. "I want to teach, but—" She paused. "I've been thinking about something Marsh said, about harm being documentable. The county school board position is documentable harm. The school I was going to help build, the children who were going to benefit from it, that's all stopped because of what Martha Good did." She looked at the landscape moving past them. "I don't want the position as a prize for winning a lawsuit. I want it because it's what I came here to do." "Those aren't mutually exclusive," he said. "No." She looked at him. "You said something the first day about building a school on your ranch. Was that part of the plan or was that—" "Both," he said. "I'd been thinking about it for a year. The families who work the ranch, their children have no school within reasonable distance. A school there makes practical sense regardless of everything else." He paused. "And yes, it also gives you, a position that's yours regardless of what the town decides to do. If the county board reinstate you, you can run both. If they don't, you have something that can't be taken because no town council can vote on what's on my land." She looked at him. "You thought of that." "I think about a lot of things," he said. "You planned for the worst outcome." "I plan for all outcomes. It's how you run a cattle operation in a territory with unpredictable weather." He glanced at her. "People aren't much different from weather. You can't control them. You can prepare for the range of what they might do." She thought about the ranch school. Children of ranch hands, children whose parents had no money and no expectation that their sons and daughters would learn to read. She thought about a first year with perhaps 8 students in a room without heat, because that was how all good schools started, cold and small and necessary. "I want to see the space," she said, "before I decide anything. I want to see where it would be, and I want to know what we'd have to work with." "It'll be a converted outbuilding to start," he said, "not what you're used to." "What I'm used to," she said, "is sanding desks smooth myself because I couldn't stand the thought of splinters. She paused. Show me the outbuilding. Oh. They came back into Dry Creek Crossing not at 10 in the morning this time, but in the late afternoon when the light was already going amber and the street was thinner of people. It was a different kind of visibility, quieter, the town settling into its evening rhythms, the particular hour when shopkeepers were tallying their day and children were being called in for supper. She saw Martha Good before Martha Good saw her. The widow was coming out of the post office, which Vivian observed with a cold clarity. Martha Good, at the post office, probably sending or receiving correspondence related to a legal defense she was now, presumably, aware she needed. She was dressed in her customary black, moving at her customary pace, which was the pace of a woman who had never in her life been in a hurry because the world arranged itself to her schedule or she rearranged the world. Then Martha Good looked up. The moment lasted perhaps 3 seconds. The two women looked at each other across the width of Main Street in the amber late afternoon light, and something passed between them that was not quite recognition. They had always recognized each other. And not quite confrontation, because nothing was said. It was the specific exchange of two people who both now understood that the terms of their relationship had been altered irrevocably and were each, in their own way, accounting for what that meant. Martha Good's face did something Vivian had not expected to see on it. Not fear, exactly, but a flicker of something that was the neighbor of fear, something that moved through her expression quickly enough that if you blinked, you'd miss it. Then it was gone, and she was back to the face she always wore, the one that looked like she was perpetually disappointed in something but maintaining her dignity about it. She turned and walked in the other direction. Vivian watched her go. Her hands were still. "She knows," Gideon said quietly beside her. "Yes." Vivian watched Martha Good's retreating back until she turned the corner by the livery. Good. The encounter with Jim Dewey happened the following morning, and it went better than expected, which meant it went worse than hoped. Vivian had gone to see him at his usual spot on the pickle barrel outside the Mercantile at 8 o'clock, when she knew he'd be there with his coffee, because Jim Dewey had been on that pickle barrel with his coffee at 8 in the morning every single day for the decade and a half. She'd known him, and she expected death itself would have to specifically schedule around it. He was there. He had his coffee. He looked at her when she walked up with the expression of a man who has been expecting a conversation and has had approximately 3 days to prepare for it and is still not adequately prepared. "Jim," she said. She sat down on the step below him without being invited, which established the terms of the conversation as hers to set. "Vivian." He wrapped both hands around his cup. He was a small man, wiry, in his 70s, with white hair and the specific posture of someone who had been listening to things from a slightly elevated position for so long that his spine had made a decision about it. "I need you to tell the truth," she said, "in court, if it comes to it, about what you heard Martha Good say." He was quiet. He looked at his coffee. He looked at the street. He looked at the Mercantile door, as if calculating whether Harlan Price was on the other side of it, and if so, what Harlan's opinion was. "I heard what I heard," he said finally. "I know you did. What I need to know is whether you'll say so under oath." He worked his jaw slightly, which was a habit she recognized from years of watching him conduct Mercantile debate. "Martha Good's got money," he said. "She does. And a lawyer by now, probably." "Almost certainly." He looked at her. He had small blue eyes that had seen 70-some years of frontier life and had arrived at a kind of clarity that sometimes comes with age, the clarity of someone who has been wrong enough times to recognize what right looks like. "You didn't do what she said you did," he said. It was not a question. "No," she said. "I didn't." He drank his coffee. He was quiet for almost a full minute. "My wife," he said, "always said that woman was trouble. She's been gone 11 years, and she's still right about things." He set the cup on his knee. "I'll testify." Vivian held the relief back where he couldn't see it, because he didn't need to see it. He was doing the right thing, and that should be unremarkable, even though it wasn't. "Thank you, Jim." "Don't thank me," he said a little gruffly. "I'm old. She can't do much to me." She almost smiled. She stood up. "I'll have the lawyer contact you about the details." "One thing," he said. She stopped. "The Henderson boy," he said. "Tommy. He was out here yesterday asking people if you were coming back to school. He asked 3 different people." He paused. "Thought you should know." She stood very still for a moment. The cold morning air moved past her. She thought about a gap-toothed 8-year-old stopping 20 feet from the schoolhouse door, turning around, going back. "Thank you," she said again. She walked away before she said anything else, because the thing she felt about Tommy Henderson was not something she wanted to say on a public street. Callie Price was harder. Callie was 31, pretty in a tired way, and had been married to Harlan Price for 8 years in the particular way that some frontier marriages worked, not unhappily, exactly, but with a clear chain of authority that everyone understood, including Callie. She found Vivian in the dry goods section of the Mercantile mid-morning when Harlan was out making a delivery, which Vivian had timed deliberately. "I need to ask you something," Vivian said. Callie looked at the door reflexively. "Harlan isn't here," Vivian said gently. "And I'm not asking about Harlan. I'm asking about you." Callie looked at her. She was a woman who had a good face for hiding things, which was a skill you developed when the things you felt didn't often have a safe place to go. "You were there," Vivian said. "You were behind the counter. You dropped the baking powder." Callie's hand stilled on the bolt of fabric she'd been reorganizing. "I don't remember that," she said. "You do remember it," Vivian said, not unkindly, but clearly. "You dropped it because you were startled, and you were startled because you knew what she'd said wasn't right, and it surprised you that she said it that way." She paused. "Callie, I taught your daughter to read. I sat with her for 2 extra hours every Tuesday for 6 weeks because she was having trouble, and I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to worry. She reads fine now. She's going to be fine." Callie blinked. Her eyes went bright quickly, and then she controlled it. "I know she does," she said quietly. "I need you to tell the truth about what you heard," Vivian said. "Not for me, because it's the truth." Callie looked at the door again. Then she looked back at Vivian. "Harlan says, I know what Harlan says. I'm asking what Callie says." A silence. The Mercantile was empty except for them. Somewhere at the back of the building, a mouse moved in the wall and then stopped. "She said it loud enough for the whole store to hear," Callie said. Her voice was carefully quiet. "She looked right at me when she said it, like she wanted a witness." Vivian held her gaze steady. "Will you say that to a lawyer?" Callie breathed in, breathed out. "Harlan's going to be angry." "Harlan's going to be on the right side of history," Vivian said, "whether he likes it or not, if you do this." Something in that seemed to reach a different part of Callie than the part that calculated Harlan's moods and managed around them. Something older, maybe. Something that had existed before Harlan. "I'll talk to the lawyer," Callie said. Her voice was soft, but it was not uncertain. Vivian nodded. She bought a spool of thread she didn't need and left. The trouble came, as trouble generally does, from the direction she wasn't watching. She had been back at the ranch 4 days, reviewing case documents with Marsh in the evenings and helping Nora in the mornings, and in the afternoons, measuring the outbuilding with Gideon that was going to become the ranch school, when Pete came in from a supply run to town with a face that meant news and not the good kind. "There's a letter," he said to Gideon. Then he glanced at Vivian. "For both of you, sort of. It's from the county school board." She took it. She read it standing in the yard with the cold coming down from the north. The county school board, in light of the ongoing public situation, and in the interest of maintaining the educational integrity of the district, had decided to place her appointment to the expanded program on indefinite hold pending resolution of what they called the outstanding community concerns. They thanked her for her service. They expressed hope for a satisfactory conclusion. They were, in the language of territorial bureaucracy, abandoning her until the direction of the wind became clearer. She read it twice. Then she folded it. Then she stood in the yard in the cold for a moment that was probably shorter than it felt. "Well," she said, to no one in particular. Gideon stood beside her. He didn't reach for the letter. He didn't ask what it said. He waited. "The board has decided to wait and see," she said. She kept her voice level because levelness was what she had, and she was not going to spend it on a letter from people who were waiting to see which way the wind blew. "They've put my appointment on hold." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a coward's move." "Yes," she said. "It is." She looked at the folded letter in her hand. She thought about the expanded school. She thought about the children who were going to have been in it. She thought about what indefinite hold meant in practice. which was that the board wanted to be able to say they hadn't formally supported her if things went badly, but wanted to reserve the option of claiming they'd never abandoned her if things went well. "Let me ask you something," Gideon said. "Go ahead." "The school here, on the ranch." He looked at the outbuilding they'd been measuring. "I've been thinking about what it would take to do it properly. Not converted, not temporary. A real building, 2 rooms, enough for expansion." He paused. "I have the materials. I have men who can build it. I've been waiting to propose it because—" He stopped. "Because it's a big thing to propose, and I didn't want it to feel like I was substituting one thing for another." She looked at him. The afternoon light was going flat the way it does in late October. No shadows. Everything the same pale gray. His face was serious in the way it always was when he meant something rather than was just saying it. "Is it a substitution?" she asked. "It doesn't have to be." He looked at the outbuilding. "You fight the case. You win the case. The county school board reinstates you to the expanded program, and you also have a school here. 2 things instead of 1. He paused. "Or if the board takes too long, or changes their mind, or decides that community concerns matter more than the truth, you have something that doesn't depend on their opinion." She looked at the outbuilding. She thought about 2 rooms. She thought about Tommy Henderson, who was 8 years old, and the children of the ranch hands, who were various ages and currently learning nothing in particular. "When could you build it?" she asked. "Spring," he said. "Start in March, done by May." She thought about what March to May meant in terms of the lawsuit. Marsh had estimated 6 to 8 months to trial, which put it somewhere in the spring or summer. She would be fighting a case, managing testimony, appearing in court, and watching a school get built on a cattle ranch simultaneously. Her mother would have said that was too much for one woman. Her mother had also, she recalled, sanded her own church pews when the minister said the congregation couldn't afford a carpenter. "Build it," she said. Gideon didn't say anything right away. He looked at the outbuilding for a moment, and then he looked at her, and there was something in his expression that she was beginning to be able to read, just barely. A quality of relief so controlled it barely showed, like something that had been held careful for a long time being set down, gently, in a place where it might be safe. "All right," he said. She looked at the letter still in her hand. She had carried it for 10 minutes, and it had already done everything it was going to do to her. She walked to the fence post at the edge of the yard and tucked it into the split wood at the top, where the wind could get at it. "Come on," she said to Gideon. "Show me where the second room goes." He fell into step beside her. Neither of them looked back at the letter. The wind, when it came, took it somewhere else entirely, which was exactly where it belonged. Winter came to Dry Creek Crossing the way it always did in that territory. Not gradually, not with warning, but with the abruptness of a door slammed shut. One week the ground was hard but passable, the sky that pale October blue, the mornings cold but manageable. The next week there was 6 inches of snow, and the wind had found every gap in every building in a 40-mile radius and was making its presence known through all of them simultaneously. Vivian noticed that winter, more than any other she had spent in the territory, had a quality of enclosure to it that was different from previous years. Not unpleasant, which surprised her. The ranch had its own rhythms that were independent of the town's rhythms, and she was learning them the way you learn a new dialect. The same basic language underneath, but the emphasis falling in different places. The ranch woke early. It worked through the middle of the day with a purposeful quiet that was different from the schoolhouse quiet she was used to. It settled in the evenings around the kitchen table or the front room fire with a kind of earned tiredness that she found, unexpectedly, restful to be near. She had her work. That mattered. She had the case documents, which Marsh sent in regular installments by courier, and she had her correspondence with him, 2 or 3 letters a week, back and forth, working through testimony and statute and strategy with the same focused attention she'd once given to curriculum planning. She had the outbuilding she had begun using as a makeshift classroom for the 4 children of ranch hands who were old enough and whose parents had agreed without much persuasion that some schooling was better than none. 4 students was not 22, but 4 students needed her to show up, which was enough. She had also, though she had not planned for it and would not have predicted it, begun to know Gideon Ashcroft. Not in any dramatic way. There was no single conversation that opened him up like a window. It happened the way most real things happen, incrementally, through proximity and shared meal tables, and the thousand small negotiations of two people occupying the same space without getting in each other's way. She learned that he read at night serious reading, history, and land law, and occasionally something she recognized as poetry, though he never mentioned it. She learned that he was genuinely good with animals in the way that comes from patience rather than authority, not commanding them but understanding them, which was a distinction most people didn't make. She learned that he had a temper he kept on a very short leash, and that the leash occasionally cost him something, and that he knew it did. He was learning her too, she supposed. She caught him watching her sometimes with the expression of a man doing a calculation he wasn't sure of the answer to, and she let him watch because she was doing the same thing, and it seemed fair. What she was not doing was allowing herself to think about what any of it meant beyond the present tense, because the present tense was sufficiently complicated without adding the future to it. Martha Good's lawyer arrived in Dry Creek Crossing in the second week of November. His name was Aldous Crane, and he came from a firm in the territorial capital that dealt primarily with property disputes and the particular kind of legal maneuvering that rich people used when they wanted to defeat other people without appearing to fight them. He was tall, well-dressed in a way that was meant to be noticed, and he had the manner of a man who had won enough cases to find losing conceptually offensive. Vivian knew he had arrived because Marsh wrote her a letter the same day Crane appeared in Caldwell to file Martha Good's response to the suit. The response was, according to Marsh, exactly what he'd predicted, a document that reframed everything. It argued that Martha Good's statement had been a private expression of concern to a neighbor, misheard and mischaracterized. It argued that Vivian's own actions, specifically her decision to take up residence at the Ashcroft Ranch and enter into what the document called a publicly acknowledged romantic association with its owner, had caused whatever damage existed to her professional reputation, not any statement made by the defendant. It argued, in its final and most pointed section, that a woman who moved onto a man's property weeks after meeting him publicly claimed her as the mother of his child had in fact demonstrated the kind of judgment that a community had every right to scrutinize. Marsh wrote, "They're going to put you on trial rather than their client. Prepare yourself for that, because they are good at it, and they will not stop." Vivian read the letter at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning with Nora across from her eating her breakfast and not asking questions, which was Nora's way of asking questions. "They're saying the damage to my reputation came from my own choices," Vivian said, because she found that saying things out loud made them more manageable, not less. Not from what Martha Good said. Nora considered this. "That's backwards," she said. "Yeah, but backwards arguments can work in court if the jury decides they want them to." She set the letter down. "They're going to spend a lot of time on the fact that I'm living here." Nora put down her fork. "You're living here because someone lied about you and you needed somewhere to be while you fight it." "I know that. You know that." Vivian paused. "A jury in this territory might decide it looks like something else." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then, with the directness of a woman who had spent 11 years managing a large and complicated household and had no patience for indirection, "Does Gideon know about this part of it?" "He will when he comes in." "He's going to be angry." "Probably." She picked up her coffee. "He's allowed to be. His name, too. Asan." Gideon came in from the morning work at 9:30, and she handed him the letter before he'd fully taken off his coat, because she had found that with him, the space between receiving information and sitting with it was better used productively than managed around. He read it. His face did what it always did when something genuinely angered him, which was become very still in a specific way, like the surface of water just before it starts to boil rather than after. She watched it and said nothing and let him finish. He set the letter on the table. "They're going after you personally," he said. "Yes. Through us." He said us without apparent self-consciousness, which she noticed. "Through the arrangement, yes. Crane is going to argue that whatever harm exists to my reputation, I created it myself by coming here." She paused. "He's also going to argue, eventually, that the original statement was made in response to legitimate community concern about the nature of my relationship with you before the statement was made. He'll try to make it look like Martha Good was responding to something real rather than inventing something false." Gideon's jaw moved slightly. "That's a lie. It's a lawyer's construction of events that omits the inconvenient parts." She looked at him. "It's also something we need to address directly. before it becomes the story. She waited. We need to talk about what we tell people about how we know each other, what the public version of this arrangement looks like. He sat down. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. What does the public version need to be? It needs to be something that makes sense in the sequence of events. You intervened publicly before you and I had spoken privately. That's the fact. The question is why. And the answer Martha Good's lawyer is going to offer is that we already had a private relationship, which makes your intervention look like a man protecting something he had rather than a man acting on principle. The actual reason is what it is, he said. I know, but the actual reason involves your sister, which is private, and I will not have that used in a courtroom without your explicit consent. She met his eyes. Is it something you're willing to have disclosed? In court? Publicly? He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she had time to think about what it cost to hold something for 6 years and then lay it out for strangers to examine. Yes, he said. His voice was even. If it's what the case needs. It might not be what it needs, she said, but it's the truth, and the truth properly told is harder to dismantle than any construction. She paused. I want to discuss it with Marsh before we decide. He nodded. He picked up the letter again, read one section a second time, set it back down. The part about your judgment, he said, moving here weeks after. That's what they'll use most. Yes. He looked at her directly. We could announce an engagement. She had been expecting this, in some form, since Caldwell. She had been thinking about how she would respond to it when it came. She had prepared a measured, practical answer that addressed the legal implications and the personal ones separately. What she actually said was, not because of a lawsuit. He held her gaze. Something in his face shifted. Not disappointment, not exactly, but something that was the neighbor of it, close enough to tell you what was living next door. No, he said. Not because of a lawsuit. A pause. But if at some point the arrangement became something else, it wouldn't be the worst legal position either. She looked at him. That's the most unromantic thing anyone has ever said in the vicinity of a possible engagement. I'm not a romantic man. I'm aware. A silence that was different from the other silences. Something had been said that hadn't quite been said. Both of them knew it, and neither of them fully addressed it, and the kitchen held it between them like a third person who was staying for a while. Let me write to Marsh, she said finally. We'll see what he thinks about the disclosure. All right. He stood. He picked up his coat. He stopped at the door. Vivian. She looked up. What they're doing. He stopped, started again. What Crane is going to do in that courtroom. What Martha Good has already done. What this whole territory seems comfortable doing to women who don't have someone standing next to them. He said it slowly, like he was working through it. I want you to know that it makes me angry, not on my behalf, on yours. She looked at him. I know it does. I don't always show that correctly. No, she agreed. But you show it. That's something. He held her gaze for one more moment, and then he went back out into the cold, and she sat with the letter and the coffee and the morning kitchen sounds, and the complicated, inconvenient, very real feeling that had been accumulating in her chest for 6 weeks and was becoming increasingly difficult to file for later. December brought Aldous Crane to Dry Creek Crossing in person. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected the legal maneuvering to stay in Caldwell, in the formal channels. But Crane, it turned out, was not interested only in the formal channels. He was interested in the kind of preparation that happened in towns, at kitchen tables and barber chairs and mercantile counters, where future jurors lived and formed opinions about what they'd already decided before they were formally asked. She knew he was in town because Pete came back from a Tuesday supply run looking like he'd eaten something that disagreed with him. That lawyer, he said. Crane. He's at the hotel. He was having dinner last night at the hotel dining room and he was talking to Elias Coburn. Gideon, who was examining a harness that needed repair, went still. Talking about what? Pete shifted his weight. Mostly about the case, general-like, not specific, but... He paused. He was saying things about Miss Mercer, about how it was a shame when a woman let one unfortunate circumstance push her into decisions she'd regret. He stopped again. I'm not saying it right. It was the way he said it, like he was painting a picture of something, not accusing, just suggesting, Like he was building a story, Vivian said from the doorway, where she'd been standing since the second sentence. She had been heading to the main house from the makeshift classroom and had heard Pete ride in. He's doing what good lawyers do when they can't win on facts alone. He's creating an atmosphere. She stepped fully into the barn. How many people heard him? The dining room was pretty full, Pete said. He looked uncomfortable, which meant he'd heard more than he'd said. He glanced at Gideon, asked some questions about the arrangement here, at the ranch. Whether you two were... He stopped. Sorry, ma'am. He used words I wouldn't repeat to you. The barn went quiet enough that the horses were audible. Gideon set down the harness. What words? He said. His voice had the quality of something that had been very controlled for a long time and was approaching the edge of that control. Gideon. Vivian said his name precisely, not loudly. He looked at her. She shook her head once. Very small, very clear. Not this way. His jaw tightened. He picked up the harness again. He did not say whatever he had been going to say. Pete, she said, thank you for telling us. Go get some supper. Pete went with the visible relief of someone excused from a difficult room. She waited until his footsteps were gone. Then she looked at Gideon, who was working the harness leather through his hands with slightly more force than the task required. He wants you angry, she said. He wants you to do something public and reactive that he can point to in court as evidence of unstable character by association. She kept her voice steady. He's very good at this. Marsh told us he was good at this. And the way he's good at it is by finding the thing that will make the person closest to the case lose their composure. Gideon looked at her. You're very calm for someone he's publicly insulted. I'm not calm, she said. I'm controlled. They're different things, and I've been practicing for 34 years. He breathed out. He set the harness down. What do we do? Nothing tonight, she said. Tonight we do exactly nothing. Tomorrow I write to Marsh and tell him what Crane is doing, and he responds through the appropriate channels. She paused. And Thursday, you and I go to town for the general store, and we have a perfectly ordinary conversation with anyone who speaks to us, and we are civil and composed, and we buy what we need, and we go home. And that helps. It denies him the story he's building, she said. He needs us to look guilty or compromised or reactive. If we're none of those things, he has to go back to the facts, and the facts are on our side. He looked at her for a long moment. You've gotten very good at this. I've had 6 weeks of practice, she said, and a very good teacher. Marsh, he said. You, she said. And she walked back out toward the main house before either of them could do anything with that. Thursday went as she'd planned, which was to say imperfectly but usably. They went to town. They conducted themselves with ordinary dignity. Elias Coburn, whom she had been anticipating with some dread, turned out to be a man who in the intervening weeks had done some private accounting of his own position and had arrived at the conclusion that he'd been too hasty. He was not precisely apologetic. He was not a man who did precise apologies. But he spoke to her at the hardware counter with a directness that was its own form of reckoning. My wife, he said, without preamble, would like you to know that she thinks this whole business is disgraceful. He seemed to be working out which part he meant. Martha Good's part of it, not yours. Vivian looked at him. Elias Coburn, who had stood in the street and not moved until she made him, was now telling her his wife disapproved of Martha Good. People and their recalibrations. They never stopped being remarkable. Please thank Mrs. Coburn, she said. She'd like to come out to the ranch, he said, if you're receiving visitors. She thinks, he cleared his throat, she thinks a call would be appropriate. A social call. From a council member's wife, in the middle of a defamation lawsuit. Vivian understood exactly what this was. A public signal, visible to the town, that a woman of standing had chosen which side to be associated with. I would be very glad to receive her, Vivian said. Any Tuesday afternoon. He nodded quickly, as if he wanted to finish the transaction before it got more complicated. He picked up the nails he'd been pretending to examine. Good day, Miss Mercer. Good day, Mr. Coburn. She walked back to where Gideon was waiting with the wagon, and she said nothing about the conversation because she needed to sit with it first, file it properly, understand what it meant for the weeks ahead. He noticed she was thinking and said nothing, which was becoming one of the things she relied on without having made a decision to rely on it. January was the hardest month. Crane made his next move in the second week, and it was, as Marsh had warned, designed specifically for endurance. He filed a counter-motion that requested a full investigation by the County Education Authority into Vivian's tenure at the Dry Creek Crossing School. Every year, every incident, every complaint, every parent communication, every grade record. It was not a motion that had any genuine legal merit in the context of the defamation case, and Marsh said so in his letter, but it was a motion that required a formal response and created a paper record that suggested there might be something worth investigating, which was the point. It was a way of making the investigation itself the story. Marsh also wrote, he has spoken with at least 2 parents from the school who have given statements suggesting Miss Mercer showed favoritism in her teaching. I want to be clear that favoritism is not a legal claim and is not relevant to the suit, but it will be mentioned. Prepare her. She read that letter on a January evening by the fire, with the wind finding every gap in the ranch house and the temperature outside sitting somewhere that Nora described, with her usual economy, as unfriendly. She read it twice, and then she put it in the file she kept organized by date, and she sat looking at the fire. Favoritism. After 15 years, 2 parents, she could guess which 2, she had a reasonable guess, because teaching was like anything else. You knew which families left with something unresolved. Had told Martha Good's lawyer that she played favorites. She thought about the extra 2 hours on Tuesdays with Callie Price's daughter. She thought about how you couldn't win. You gave more to the children who needed more, and someone called it favoritism. You gave equally to everyone, and someone said you didn't care enough about the ones who struggled. You spent 15 years in a classroom, and it still came down to 2 parents and a lawyer and a winter fire. Gideon came in from the back of the house and read whatever was on her face with the efficiency of someone who had been reading her face for 2 months without acknowledging that he was. "What is it?" he said. She told him. She told him specifically because she had found that vague summaries made him more tense, not less. He did better with the actual thing than with the managed version of the actual thing. He sat down across from her. He listened. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. 2 parents out of 15 years, he said. 2 parents is enough to create the suggestion of a pattern, she said. That's all he needs. Not proof, just suggestion. Who are they? I don't know for certain. He looked at her steadily. Who do you think? She sighed. The Harmon family. Their son struggled every year I had him, and his parents believed that was my fault rather than... She stopped. And probably the Wentworths. Their daughter was bright enough to skip a grade, and I didn't recommend it because she wasn't emotionally ready for it, and her mother never forgave me for that opinion. He nodded slowly. So one family whose child struggled, one whose child was held back. Which looks, in a certain light, like the teacher favored easy students. It also looks, he said, like a teacher making careful decisions about individual children rather than blanket ones. I know that. Marsh needs to make that argument, he said. Not later, now, before Crane's version has time to settle. She looked at him. That's exactly right. She pulled the file toward her. I'll write tonight. Vivian. He said her name the way he did when he meant something more than whatever he was about to say. She looked up. You didn't do anything wrong. In 15 years of teaching, you didn't do anything wrong. Don't let them make you review it like you did. She held his gaze. I know I didn't. But reviewing it isn't weakness. Knowing every corner of what they might attack is how I make sure they can't surprise me with it. He was quiet. Then, you're the most prepared person I have ever known in my life. She almost smiled. Coming from a man who sent a lawyer's letter on someone's behalf before he'd spoken to her, I take that as a high compliment. The corner of his mouth moved. It was meant as one. February was when things broke open. And they broke open from a direction none of them had fully anticipated, which was, Vivian thought later, the nature of things that break. They never come from where you're watching. Marsh arrived at the ranch in person, which he had not done before. He came on a Wednesday morning with the look of a man who had ridden hard and slept inadequately and was carrying information he was not certain how to deliver. Nora put coffee in front of him before he'd finished unwrapping his scarf, and he drank half of it before he spoke. Something has come to light, he said. He put a paper on the table. A woman named Agnes Fowler. She lived in Cutter's Creek 4 years ago, when Martha Good was living there before she came to Dry Creek Crossing. Vivian looked at the paper. The dressmaker, she said. The second case, the one that hadn't made it to court. The woman who left. Agnes Fowler didn't simply leave Cutter's Creek, Marsh said. She left, went to her sister's in Nebraska, and then came back to the territory 18 months ago. She's living in a town called Ridgeline, about 60 miles east. He paused. She wrote to the territorial law office 6 weeks ago. She'd heard, through correspondence with someone in Cutter's Creek, that a suit had been filed against Martha Good. She said she was willing to come forward. The kitchen was very quiet. Vivian looked at the paper again. A woman who had packed her things and left rather than fight, who had been gone for years, had heard about a case in a different town involving the same person and had written a letter offering to testify. She thought about what it takes to do that, to come back into the light of something you'd spent years putting behind you because someone else was in it and you could help. She'll testify, she said. She's prepared to. Marsh wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. She has documentation, letters Martha Good wrote during the campaign against her. Witness names from Cutter's Creek who will corroborate. He paused. It changes the case substantially. It's no longer one incident, it's a pattern. 2 cases, different territories, same method, same person. Gideon, who had been standing at the back of the kitchen since Marsh arrived, exhaled slowly. That's it, he said quietly. That's what wins it. It significantly improves our position, Marsh said carefully, in the language of a man who had won enough cases to be cautious about certainty. Crane will challenge her credibility. He'll say she has a personal grievance. He'll say she's seeking revenge for something that happened years ago in a different place. He looked at Vivian. But her documentation is substantial, and her witnesses are credible, and the jury will see what it is. Vivian sat with it for a moment. Agnes Fowler, 60 miles east, who had left rather than fight, and was now choosing to come back. She thought about the dressmaker who had packed her things. She thought about 2 empty cases in Marsh's file. She thought about what it had cost this woman to write that letter. I want to meet her, she said, before the trial. Marsh nodded. I expected you would. I've written to her. And I want to write to her myself. She looked at Gideon. Will you lend me Pete for a day to carry a letter to Ridgeline directly rather than through the post? Tomorrow morning, he said. She sat down properly and pulled a piece of paper from the case file and picked up a pen. She thought for a moment about what to say to a woman she'd never met who had been brave in a way that was costly and quiet and aimed at helping a stranger. Then she wrote steadily, in her clean, even hand, the letter that she intended to mean something. Agnes Fowler arrived at the ranch on the 2nd Saturday of February. She was younger than Vivian had expected, early 30s, with a face that had the specific quality of someone who had recovered from something significant and was still, in some lights, in the process of it. She was a small woman, careful in her movements, who shook Vivian's hand with a grip that was firmer than expected, and then looked around the ranch yard with an expression Vivian couldn't immediately read. You stayed, Agnes said. It was the first thing she said. I stayed, Vivian said. Agnes nodded slowly. I didn't, she said. I knew I should have. I knew even while I was packing that I should have stayed and fought it, but I was... She stopped. She looked at the yard. I was so tired and so ashamed, not of what she said, I knew it wasn't true, but ashamed of... I don't know how to describe it exactly. Ashamed of what it felt like to have people believe it, like the believing made it real even though it wasn't. Vivian looked at her. She knew that feeling. She had carried it for 3 days before she'd identified what it was and set it down deliberately, like a heavy thing you set down, not because it isn't real, but because carrying it isn't helping you walk. I understand that, she said simply. Agnes looked at her. I know you do. That's why I wrote. She paused. When I heard someone was fighting her, actually fighting, not just weathering it, not just enduring it until she moved on to someone else, I thought... She stopped again. She breathed in. I thought if you could do it with everything she was going to throw at you, the least I could do was tell the truth. Nora appeared in the doorway at exactly the right moment with coffee and what she called her consideration biscuits, which she only made when someone had arrived who had traveled a long way for a difficult reason. Agnes Fowler sat at the kitchen table and told her story, and Vivian listened to every word of it, and when it was done, she reached across the table and put her hand over Agnes's briefly, just once, because there was nothing adequate to say, and she wasn't going to say anything inadequate, And Agnes looked at her hand and then away out the window and composed herself with the efficiency of someone who had been composing herself in difficult moments for a long time. Then Vivian got out her pen and paper, and together they began to map the testimony, detail by careful detail, building the architecture of what was going to be said in a Caldwell courtroom in the spring, when everything would finally be put in front of people who were going to have to choose between a truth and a construction. The trial date was set for the 14th of April. It was February 7th. They had 66 days. In those 66 days, something else happened, slower and less dramatic than the legal machinery, but no less real. She and Gideon had dinner together every evening because that was the nature of sharing a house, and they worked in proximity every day, and they argued twice, once about the testimony structure, where she was right, and once about the outbuilding-turned-classroom heating situation, where he was right, and she conceded it with a terseness that made Nora hide a smile behind her dishcloth. They had the argument that people who spend time together eventually have, about space and assumption, and what each of them needed from the arrangement that wasn't being said directly, and it lasted 40 minutes and ended with both of them in different rooms for 2 hours before she knocked on his office door and said, "I was wrong about the thing I said at the end of the argument." And he said, "Which thing specifically?" And she said, "The thing about not needing anyone." And he looked at her for a moment and said, "I was wrong about the thing I said in the middle." And she said, "The thing about knowing what I want." And he said, "Yes." And she said, "Yes." And they went back to dinner and Nora didn't say anything, which was the most eloquent thing she could have done. The day before the trial, she was in the makeshift classroom after the children had gone home, straightening desks that didn't need straightening, when he came in and stood in the doorway. The March light was coming through the one window at that low afternoon angle that made everything look slightly amber and deliberate. "Are you ready?" he said. She turned around. She looked at him standing in the doorway of a converted outbuilding that smelled of chalk and cold wood, and the particular smell of children who have been sitting still for an hour. And she thought about Tuesday morning in October, in a real schoolhouse, at a blackboard, with chalk dust on her fingers, and the world still intact. "I've been ready since October," she said. He nodded. He stepped into the room. He looked at the 4 small desks, the chalkboard she'd hung herself, the shelf of books she'd brought from her rooms. He looked at it with the expression of a man looking at something that matters to him. "When this is over," he said, without looking at her, "and the new school is built—" He stopped. He was quiet for a moment. "I want to ask you something, after the trial, when it's done." She looked at him. "Ask me now." He looked at her then. "No," he said, not unkindly. "After. Because I want it to have nothing to do with any of this." He gestured, slightly, at the file she was still holding, at the machinery of the last 6 months. "I want it to just be itself." She held his gaze. She thought about what he might ask. She thought about what she might answer. She thought about a man sitting on a back porch in October at midnight, and the particular sound of a house where someone was carrying something heavy. "All right," she said, "after." He turned and walked back out into the yard, and she stood in the small classroom with the March light coming through the one window, and she felt something that was not quite peace and not quite anticipation, but was somewhere in the exact middle of both, which she thought, on consideration, might be the best place she had stood in a very long time. Tomorrow was the trial. The courthouse in Caldwell was not an impressive building. It had been constructed with the same pragmatic indifference to aesthetics that characterized most territorial architecture: functional walls, adequate windows, a roof that kept most of the weather out. Inside, the courtroom smelled of wood oil and old paper and the specific staleness of a room used for serious purposes by people who were nervous. The benches filled early on the morning of April 14th, because in a territory where entertainment was scarce and justice was theater, a defamation trial involving the largest landowner in the county and a schoolteacher who had refused to leave was not something people intended to miss. Vivian arrived with Marsh and Gideon at 8 in the morning, which was 40 minutes before the session opened, because Marsh believed in the tactical value of already being present when opposing counsel arrived. She wore her good dress, the dark blue wool one that she'd owned for 6 years, and that fit her correctly, and communicated, without stating it, that she was a woman who took things seriously. She carried the case file herself, under her arm, because she had organized it and she knew where everything was, and she was not going to hand it to someone else, and then need to ask for it back at a critical moment. Crane was already there. She had expected that, and still it required something from her to walk past him with her chin level and her pace unchanged. I was a tall man who used his height the way some men use money, as a kind of ambient pressure, always present, requiring effort to resist. He looked at her when she came in with an expression that was courteous in its surface and entirely without warmth beneath it, and he said, "Miss Mercer," and she said, "Mr. Crane," and they took their respective sides of the room. Martha Good came in 10 minutes later. She was in black, as always, but it was a different black than usual. A more formal black, Sunday black, the black of a woman who had dressed for an occasion. She sat in the gallery, not at the defense table, which meant Crane had advised her to maintain a particular posture of dignity rather than proximity to the legal proceedings. She did not look at Vivian. She looked at the front of the room and composed her face into the expression she had apparently decided on, which was one of pained forbearance, as if she were the injured party who had graciously agreed to endure this process. Vivian looked at her for exactly as long as it took to confirm that she was there and to note the expression. Then she looked away and opened her file and reviewed her notes for the last time before the session began. Marsh had explained the structure to her in detail, but knowing the structure and living through it were different things. The opening statements took the morning. Crane's was polished and precise and did exactly what she'd predicted. It painted a picture of a community expressing legitimate concern and a woman who had made choices that invited scrutiny and then blamed someone else for the scrutiny. He used the words poor judgment 4 times. He used the word unfortunate 6 times. He never once said anything that was factually false, which was, she had come to understand, the most dangerous kind of argument. Marsh's opening was shorter and more direct. He laid out the sequence of events without embellishment. He said Martha Good stated publicly, before witnesses, that Vivian Mercer was carrying a child out of wedlock, and he let the sentence sit in the room without decoration. He named the witnesses. He named the dates. He said the word pattern once, deliberately, and let the jury wonder what he meant by it, because a jury that wonders is a jury that pays attention. Vivian watched the jury. 8 men, which was what territorial courts produced. 2 of them she recognized. One was a farmer from outside Dry Creek Crossing whose daughter she had taught 4 years ago, and one was a hardware merchant from Caldwell, whom she didn't know at all. She looked at their faces while Marsh spoke, and she tried to read them the way she read children in a classroom, looking for the ones who were already decided and the ones who were still open. 3 were already decided, she thought. 2 for her, 1 against. The other 5 were the ones that mattered. She had learned in 6 months of living inside this case that justice was not a pure thing. It was a human thing, which meant it was inconsistent and subject to mood and vulnerable to narrative, and occasionally arrived at the right answer through a chain of reasoning that had as much to do with who told the story better as with what actually happened. She did not find this comforting, but she found it true, and truth, even uncomfortable truth, was more useful than comfort. Jim Dewey was the first witness called. He came to the stand with the careful movement of a man his age, navigating public attention, which he did not especially enjoy, and he settled himself in the chair and looked at Marsh with the expression of a man who has made a decision and intends to keep it. Marsh took him through it methodically, what he had heard, when, where, how many people were present, what the specific words were. Jim Dewey said the words clearly, at a volume the full courtroom could hear. That schoolteacher is carrying a bastard child. He said it without flinching, which was braver than it looked, because saying something like that in a public room full of people, while the woman who said it was sitting 15 feet away watching you, required a specific kind of backbone that not everyone had. Then Crane stood up. "Mr. Dewey," he said pleasantly, "how old are you?" 74. "And your hearing, would you say it's as sharp as it once was?" Jim Dewey looked at him with the flat blue eyes of a man who had been underestimated by younger people for at least 2 decades. "Sharp enough to know what I heard," he said. "Of course, but in a busy shop, with ambient noise, voices from multiple directions." "She said it in the doorway," Jim Dewey said. "Store was quiet, coffee was fresh, I heard every word." Crane shifted slightly. "And you'd say you and Mrs. Good have always had a cordial relationship?" "I'd say we've had a civil one," Jim said. "Which is different." A murmur moved through the gallery. Crane let it die before he continued. He spent another 10 minutes trying to find a gap in Jim Dewey's account and did not find one, which Vivian noted with a satisfaction she kept entirely off her face. Callie Price was harder to watch because Callie was visibly frightened in a way that Jim Dewey wasn't. She sat in the witness chair with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes moving between Marsh and the floor. And when she spoke, her voice was quieter than it needed to be, and Marsh had to ask her twice to speak up. But she said what she'd said she would say. She confirmed the words. She confirmed the volume. She said, when Marsh asked her specifically, she looked right at me when she said it, like she wanted me to hear. That last sentence landed in the room with the weight of something specific and true. Crane, cross-examining, tried a different approach with Callie than he'd used with Jim. He was gentler, almost sympathetic, as if he understood that Callie was not an adversary, but someone who had been put in an uncomfortable position. "Mrs. Price," he said, "you've known Martha Good for how long?" "About 8 years." "And in those 8 years, has she ever struck you as a malicious person?" Callie was quiet for a moment. Vivian watched her face. "No," Callie said. "So is it possible," Crane said gently, "that what you heard was someone expressing a genuine concern, in a private moment, that simply carried further than she intended?" Callie looked at her hands. The courtroom waited. "She looked right at me," Callie said again, quietly but clearly. "When someone says something private, they don't look around to see who's listening." It was the best answer Callie Price had ever given in her life, and Vivian was fairly certain Callie hadn't known she was going to say it until she did. The afternoon of the second day was Agnes Fowler's testimony, and it was the hinge on which everything turned. Agnes came to the stand with the composure of someone who had rehearsed this. Not her words, Vivian knew, because Agnes was not a woman who gave rehearsed testimony, but her breathing, her posture, the specific act of sitting in a public room and saying true things about something that had broken her life. She had rehearsed the composure. Everything else she said from the plain surface of what had happened. She told the story of Cutter's Creek. She named the words Martha Good had used then. Different words, same mechanism. She produced through Marsh the letters. 3 of them, written by Martha Good, during the campaign against her, passed through a mutual acquaintance who had kept them for reasons Agnes no longer remembered but was grateful for. The letters were read aloud. They were specific. They were deliberate. They were the letters of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and was coordinating it with care. The courtroom was very quiet during the reading. Vivian looked at the jury. The 5 who had been open were no longer quite as open as before. Something had shifted in them. Not decided, not yet, but repositioning, the way a scale repositions when additional weight is added to one side. She looked at Martha Good. Martha Good was looking at Agnes Fowler with an expression that had, for the first time in 6 months, lost its composure. Not dramatically. It wasn't the breakdown of someone caught in a lie. It was smaller than that. It was the expression of someone who had believed, confidently and for a long time, that the past stayed where you put it, and who was now discovering that this was not always true. Agnes Fowler had come back. From Nebraska, from silence, from the years she had spent putting Cutter's Creek behind her, Agnes Fowler had come back and was sitting in a chair in Caldwell saying true things, with her hands folded in her lap and her voice steady. And there was nothing Martha Good could do about it. Crane's cross-examination of Agnes was the most aggressive of the trial. He challenged her memory, her motives, her timeline. He suggested the letters were misinterpreted. He suggested Agnes harbored a personal grievance that colored her account. He was thorough, and he was skilled, and he was, Vivian thought, watching him, also fighting a losing battle, and some part of him knew it. Agnes answered every question plainly. She did not become defensive. She did not become emotional. When Crane suggested her grievance colored her testimony, she said, "I drove 60 miles to tell the truth about something I watched happen to myself, and am watching happen to someone else. If that's a grievance, I'll keep it." The farmer on the jury, the one with the daughter Vivian had taught, closed his eyes briefly. Then he opened them and wrote something on the paper in front of him. Gideon testified on the morning of the 3rd day. He had not wanted to testify about Clara. He had not said this directly, but Vivian knew it the way she had come to know most things about him. Not from what he said, but from the particular quality of his silence when the subject came near. She had asked him, 3 days before the trial, whether he was certain. She had told him it was not required. She had told him that they had other testimony, strong testimony, and that his personal history did not need to be offered if he didn't want it to be. He had said, "It's relevant. It tells the jury why a man with no prior connection to you would get off his horse on a Tuesday morning and say what I said. Without it, Crane makes it look calculated. With it, it's what it is." He had paused. Put it in. On the stand, he told the story of Clara plainly. He did not dress it up. He said his sister's name. He said what had happened to her and why. He said that he had made a decision after her death, and that the decision was what it was. He said it in the flat, even voice he used for things that mattered too much for decoration. The courtroom, which had been attentive throughout, went to a particular quality of quiet during his testimony that was different from the other quiets. Vivian, sitting at the table beside Marsh, kept her eyes forward and breathed carefully and did not look at Gideon while he spoke, because looking at him would have cost her the composure she needed for the rest of the day. Crane's cross-examination was brief. There was not much to attack in the testimony of a man who had admitted, fully and without defensiveness, exactly why he'd done what he'd done. Crane asked a few questions about the nature of Vivian's residence at the ranch, trying one final time to make it look like something it wasn't. Gideon answered with the same simplicity he'd brought to everything else. "She needed a safe place to prepare a legal case," he said. "I had one. That's what it was." "And your feelings toward Miss Mercer," Crane said, with the tone of a man playing a card he knew was weak, "are strictly professional?" Gideon looked at Crane for a moment. Then he said, "No, but that's not what this case is about." Vivian kept her eyes forward. Under the table, she pressed her fingers flat against her palm and breathed. Marsh put her on the stand last. She had thought she was ready. She had reviewed every question he intended to ask her, and every question Crane was likely to ask her, and she had organized her answers with the same care she brought to curriculum planning. She had thought she was ready. What she had not accounted for was how it would feel to sit in a chair in a public room and say the truth about yourself to strangers who had the power to decide whether the truth was sufficient. Marsh took her through it gently. The school, the 15 years, the morning of October's third week, the words she had heard secondhand and the silence she had walked into, and the 30 people who had not asked her a single question before deciding. She answered everything clearly. She did not perform distress, but she did not perform composure either. She was simply present, in the way that 15 years of standing in front of children had taught her to be, fully there, fully accountable for what she was saying, willing to be seen. Then Crane stood up. He was good. She had known he was good, and she found, in the actual experience of it, that knowing someone is good at a thing and being the subject of their skill were very different conditions. He did not attack her directly. He circled. He asked questions about her choices, her timeline, her decision to go to the ranch. He asked questions that contained their own implications, the kind that don't need to state a thing directly, because the question itself plants the thought. At one point, he said, "Miss Mercer, isn't it true that moving onto a man's property within 48 hours of meeting him represents a rather unconventional choice for a woman in your position?" And she said, "A woman in my position had been publicly accused of something false and had been offered a place to prepare a legal response by the only person in the territory who had offered her anything except contempt. The choice was exactly as conventional as the situation required." She heard something in the gallery that might have been a stifled response. Crane pressed on. "And you don't find it at all possible that Martha Good's statement, however imprecise in its phrasing, reflected genuine community concern about—" "No," she said. She said it before he finished the sentence, which she knew was technically wrong form and didn't care. Because genuine community concern asks questions. Genuine community concern knocks on a door. Genuine concern does not stand in a doorway at a calculated volume and state something as fact that the speaker knows to be false. She paused. "I spent 15 years in that school. I taught their children to read and to calculate and to think. And not one person who heard Martha Good's words that morning walked 20 feet to my door and asked me if they were true." She looked at Crane steadily. "That is not concern. That is a community choosing the easier story." The silence after that was complete. Crane was quiet for a moment. Then he said quietly, "No further questions." The jury took 4 hours. She sat in the anteroom with Marsh and Gideon and drank 2 cups of terrible coffee and did not talk much because there was nothing useful left to say. Marsh reviewed his papers. Gideon sat with his forearms on his knees and his hands loosely clasped and looked at the floor with the concentrated stillness of a man who had done everything he could do and was now in the part of the process that was entirely outside his control, which she suspected was the part he found hardest. She looked at him. She thought about a back porch in October at midnight. She thought about 12 miles of road and a lawyer's letter sent before they'd spoken. She thought about after. At 3:30, they were called back in. The verdict was read by the jury foreman, a man she didn't know, in the flat tone of someone accustomed to being official. The words were legal words, structured and formal, but underneath them was the plain thing. Martha Good had made a false and defamatory public statement. The harm was real. The plaintiff prevailed. Vivian sat very still when the words were read. She had expected, if they won, to feel something large, relief or triumph, or the particular sharp satisfaction of being proved right. What she actually felt was quieter than any of those things. It was more like the feeling of setting down something heavy after carrying it for a long time. Not exhilaration, just the absence of the weight. She looked across the room at Martha Good. Martha Good's face had done something Vivian had not expected. Not the composure, not the forbearance. The composure was gone entirely, and what was underneath it was something smaller and more human, a woman who had expected, probably for a long time, that her version of events would hold, that the construction would be enough, that the pattern would continue to work. And it hadn't worked this time, and she was sitting with that. Vivian did not feel triumph looking at her. She felt, which also surprised her, something closer to pity. Not the pity of superiority, but the simpler pity of recognizing that someone has spent years using a harmful thing as a hammer, and is now holding a hammer with no nails and no wall and no purpose, and that is its own particular kind of diminished life. She looked away from Martha Good. She looked at Marsh, who was gathering his papers with the efficient calm of a man who had won enough cases to receive the news without theatrics. He caught her eye and nodded once. She nodded back. Then she looked at Gideon, who was already looking at her. He didn't say anything. His face said what it needed to say in the way it did when things mattered, which was through what it held back rather than what it showed. She thought she saw, beneath the control, the specific relief of a man who has been carrying his sister in one arm and a promise in the other for 6 years, and has finally been allowed to set one of them down gently. She reached across and put her hand on his briefly. His hand turned and held hers for a moment. Then Marsh said something about post-trial documentation, and they both looked at him, and the moment passed into the category of things that had happened and been real and would not need to be discussed to be true. Martha Good left Dry Creek Crossing 11 days after the verdict. She did not announce it. She did not say goodbye to anyone who later admitted to it publicly. She packed what she had and arranged for the sale of her property, and she left in the early morning before the street was full, which was the last strategic decision she made in a life that had been full of them. Where she went, Vivian did not know and did not ask, because where Martha Good went was no longer her concern. The county school board sent a letter 17 days after the verdict. It was formal and careful and contained the specific language of institutional self-preservation, expressions of continued confidence, renewed commitment to educational excellence, and a formal reinstatement of Vivian's appointment to the expanded school district program, effective at her earliest convenience. She read it at the kitchen table at the ranch and handed it to Gideon without comment and drank her coffee. He read it. He set it down. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "What are you going to do with it?" She had been thinking about that since Marsh told her the letter was coming, which he had because he had sources at the board and believed in preparing his clients for good news as carefully as for bad. She had been thinking about it for a week, turning it over the way you turn over a thing you already know the answer to but want to be certain of before you say it out loud. "Take it," she said. "Run the district program and the ranch school both." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "Agnes Fowler has agreed to teach here 3 days a week while I'm in town. She's good with children." She paused. "We worked it out last week." He looked at her. "You worked it out last week." "I thought it was likely we'd win." "You were that certain." "I was that prepared," she said, which was different, and he knew it. I was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Vivian." She looked at him. "I said after the trial," he said. "It's after the trial." She set down her cup. "Yes," she said. "It is." He looked at her with the expression she had been learning to read for 6 months, the one that lived between assessment and something else, the something else she had been filing for later since October. He said, "I'm not going to make a speech about this." "I know you're not," she said. "I'm going to ask you one thing, and I want an honest answer." "You've always had honest answers," she said. "Do you want to stay?" he said. "Not because the school is here, not because it's practical, not because we've built something that makes leaving complicated." He held her eyes. "Because you want to." She looked at him. She thought about 19 years old and 72 cents and a frontier that had sounded like freedom. She thought about what freedom had actually looked like. The loneliness of choosing it yourself, the choosing that is also a cost, the specific cold of a life built entirely from your own materials with no one to share the weight of the building. She thought about a converted outbuilding and 4 small desks and chalk dust, and the smell of children learning things, and a man who read poetry at night and didn't mention it and kept his promises for 6 years because he had decided that was who he was. "Yes," she said, "because I want to." He reached across the table and took her hand and held it with the same quality as everything he did. No excess, no performance, just the plain weight of something real. She held his hand and looked at the kitchen window and the April morning outside it, the land that was starting to go green at the edges after the long winter, the kind of green that comes back. Not because it was ever entirely gone, but because the conditions have finally become correct. "The school building goes up in May," he said. "I know, I have opinions about the window placement." "I know you do," he said. "You've mentioned it 4 times. "The light matters," she said. "The light matters," he agreed. They sat there at the kitchen table with the morning coming through the window and the coffee going cold between them and the April land outside going green, and it was ordinary in the way that only hard-won things ever get to be ordinary, and neither of them said anything else for a while because there was nothing that needed to be said. The school opened in June. 2 rooms, proper windows on the east side because Vivian had been right about the light, a wood stove that didn't smoke, and 21 students on the first day, ranch children, children from farms on the territory's edge, 2 children whose parents had heard about it from someone who had heard about it from someone else, and had driven 8 miles to enroll them. Tommy Henderson was there, gap-toothed, and 8.5, and incandescently pleased about it, because his parents had decided, in the way that people decide things after watching which way the wind settled, that Miss Mercer was exactly where their son ought to be. She stood at the board on that first morning in the new room with the good light coming through the east windows, and she looked at 21 faces, and she thought about 22 desks she had sanded smooth herself in a different schoolhouse in a different time. She thought about the things you build, and the things that get taken, and the difference between the two, which was not always as clear as you'd like it to be. She thought about Agnes Fowler, who was in the next room at that moment teaching 8 children the alphabet with a patience and humor that Vivian had recognized immediately as the patience and humor of someone who had been through something difficult and had come out the other side with a better understanding of what mattered. She picked up her chalk. She wrote the date on the board, June 14th. She wrote it in her clean, even hand, the hand that had been doing this for 16 years now. The hand that had been steady in streets and courtrooms and kitchen tables and 40 miles of frontier road. The hand that had held other people's grief and her own, and had not, in the end, dropped either. 21 faces looked at her. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning, Miss Mercer," 21 voices said back, in the ragged unison of children who haven't yet learned to start at exactly the same time. She smiled. Not the controlled smile, not the professional smile. Not the smile she had been using for 6 months to communicate messages to people watching her in public spaces. The actual one. The one that had been waiting since October for a room where it was safe to exist. "Let's start," she said. What happened to them afterward was not a fairy tale, because fairy tales end at the beginning of things, and what came after was the actual middle of a life, which is harder and more interesting and does not resolve into clean endings. They married in August, quietly, with Marcia Nora and Agnes Fowler and Jim Dewey present, because those were the people who had been there when it was difficult, and that seemed like the right qualification for being there when it was good. Gideon wore his second-best coat because his best one had a button missing and he had not gotten around to replacing it, which was the kind of detail that is more real than any other kind. Vivian wore the dark blue dress, the same one she had worn to court, because she had decided that a dress that had done good work deserved to be used again. The ranch school grew. By the second year, there were 34 students and a third teacher, a young woman from the county's eastern edge, who had a certificate and no position, and whom Vivian had written to directly after hearing about her through Marcia's network. The district program expanded. Vivian traveled to communities that had never had a school and helped them build ones. Not always with walls and windows, sometimes just with materials and a letter and a clear set of instructions for what was actually required for children to learn things, which was less than most people thought and more consistent than most people managed. Dry Creek Crossing, which had tried to erase her, did what towns do. It kept going. It changed slowly. It contained people who had been wrong and never admitted it, and people who had been wrong and eventually did, in their own ways and on their own timelines, which is how human reckoning generally works. Elias Coburn's wife became, improbably, one of the school's most reliable supporters and donors, which was her version of an apology, and Vivian accepted it as such. Gideon built things. He expanded the cattle operation and improved the water systems on the land, and did business with the kinds of people who did business with a man who was known to be fair, even when being fair was not the fastest path to profit. He was still not a romantic man. He said what he meant and meant what he said, and occasionally said things in the wrong order or at the wrong moment, and then had to sit with that, which he did with the same control and occasional imperfect result as everything else. He was not easy in the way that people who require nothing of you are easy. He was the other kind, the kind that is worth the difficulty because the difficulty is made of something real. She was not easy either. She had opinions about window placement and correct grammar and the precise amount of time a person should be allowed to maintain a wrong position before someone pointed it out to them. And she was sometimes right about things in a way that did not leave room for the other person to arrive there themselves, which was a habit she identified and worked on with imperfect success for the rest of her life. They argued. They were wrong about things, separately and together. They built something that was not perfect and was entirely theirs, which is the only kind of thing worth building. 16 years after a woman stood at a blackboard on an October morning and heard the sound of a town going wrong, Vivian Mercer stood in the same spot, same board, same hand, the actual original Dry Creek Crossing schoolhouse, because the county had asked her to teach a demonstration lesson to a group of new teachers from across the territory. And she looked at the room and she thought about what had happened in it and what had happened because of it. She did not think, I survived. That was too small. Survival was the floor, not the ceiling. She thought, I chose. Every step of the way, surrounded by people who wanted her to make the easier choice, she had chosen the harder one, not because she was particularly brave or particularly good, but because she had looked at the easy choice each time and found it insufficient, and insufficiency had always bothered her more than difficulty. She had chosen to stay in the street instead of hiding. She had chosen the lawsuit instead of the road. She had chosen the ranch school when the county board retreated, and she had chosen the courtroom seat beside her lawyer rather than the waiting room, and she had chosen, after the verdict, to say yes to a man who asked a plain question and deserved a plain answer. She had also chosen, quietly and without announcement, to not become someone who measured other people by whether they had stood up for her in October. Elias Coburn had not stood up. Harlan Price had not stood up. A dozen people she had known for 15 years had stood on the wrong side of a street on the wrong morning and had chosen, under pressure, to believe the easier story. She had not forgiven them out of virtue. She had let it go out of practicality, because carrying it would have made her a smaller person with less capacity for the work, and the work was what mattered. That was the thing she had learned, underneath all the other things. Not that truth always wins, because it doesn't. Not that good people are protected, because they aren't. Not that justice is reliable, or communities are trustworthy, or that the right person will always show up at the right time, because all of that is contingent and fragile and subject to wind. What she had learned was this: the story you tell about what happens to you is yours to tell. Other people will tell their versions. The town told its version. Martha Good told hers. Crane constructed one out of half-truths and implications and professional skill, and all of those versions existed, and some people believed them, and nothing could be done about that. But Vivian Mercer's version was also real, and she had stood up in it and told it clearly and refused to let anyone else's telling replace it. That was, in the end, the only victory that couldn't be taken. Not the verdict, not the reinstatement, Not the school or the ranch or the man who had ridden 12 miles on a Tuesday morning. Those things could change. Life was long and territory was unpredictable, and nothing outside yourself was permanent. But you knew what you had done. You knew whether you had stayed or gone, whether you had spoken or been silent, whether you had let fear write the ending or refused to hand it the pen. And no lawyer and no widow in black and no crowd of 30 people with their collective silence and sideways looks could reach inside you and change what you knew. She picked up her chalk. She turned to face the new teachers waiting to learn something.